Imagine watching a rescue helicopter lift off towards someone in distress, its rotors cutting through the air with purpose, only for that helicopter to never return. The crew sent to save others, vanishing as completely as those they were meant to rescue. It is an inversion of the natural order, a betrayal of the one certainty we expect from emergency response, that help, once called, will arrive and bring people home. Yet across decades and continents, rescue missions have disappeared into silence, leaving behind only questions and the unsettling possibility that some places, some moments, exist outside the boundaries we believe govern reality. These are not stories of mechanical failure or pilot error, though investigations often reach for such explanations when faced with the alternative. These are cases where helicopters vanish from radar, where crews experience time moving at impossible speeds or grinding to a halt, where the rescued return from eras they should not have accessed, and where the physical evidence left behind defies every logical framework. Mountains, oceans, storms, and even clear skies have swallowed rescue teams whole, or returned them changed in ways that suggest they briefly existed somewhere else entirely. In this documentary, we examine rescue missions that became mysteries as deep as the emergencies they were meant to resolve. Dawn broke over the Karakoram Range on July 18, 1995, as a Pakistani military helicopter lifted off from Skardu, its rotors slicing through thin mountain air. The morning was clear, the kind of crystalline visibility that mountaineers pray for at altitude, with K2's massive pyramid rising against a pale blue sky. On board were 4 crew members, led by Captain Rashid Khalil, a pilot with over 12 years of high-altitude experience navigating the treacherous peaks along the disputed northern borders. They were headed toward the mountain's southwest face, where 2 Polish climbers had become stranded at 23,000 feet following an equipment failure that left them unable to descend safely. The mission was straightforward within the helicopter's operational limits, and the weather forecast promised stable conditions for at least the next 6 hours. The crew had gone through the standard pre-flight checks with meticulous care, aware that flying at such altitudes left no margin for error. Oxygen systems were tested twice, fuel calculations verified, and radio equipment confirmed operational. The stranded climbers had made contact the previous evening, their voices strained but coherent as they described their position on a narrow ledge just below the bottleneck couloir. Other expeditions on the mountain had visual confirmation of their location, and rescue coordinators in Islamabad were confident the helicopter could reach them before afternoon winds made flight impossible. As the aircraft climbed steadily toward the mountain, the crew maintained regular communication with base, their transmissions calm and routine. At 7:42 a.m., Captain Khalil reported passing through 18,000 feet and confirmed visual contact with K2's summit. The helicopter's position was marked clearly on tracking systems, its altitude and heading exactly as planned. 3 minutes later, the radio crackled with a transmission that would be the last anyone would hear from the crew. Khalil's voice, usually steady and professional, carried an edge of confusion as he described what he called unusual atmospheric distortion ahead. The air appeared to shimmer in a way that did not match typical thermal patterns, he reported, and the instruments were showing erratic readings, despite the clear conditions. Before ground control could respond with instructions, the transmission ended abruptly, not with static or interference, but with a clean silence, as though someone had simply switched off the radio mid-sentence. Attempts to re-establish contact failed immediately. The helicopter's radar signature, which had been strong and consistent throughout the ascent, vanished from tracking screens without fading or drifting. It simply disappeared, leaving controllers staring at empty displays where the aircraft should have been. Emergency protocols were activated within minutes, and rescue coordination centers across Pakistan and China began mobilizing resources for what everyone hoped would be a simple radio malfunction and emergency landing. Search aircraft were airborne within the hour, sweeping the valleys and glaciers below K2's southwest face, their crews scanning for any sign of wreckage or the bright orange paint of the downed helicopter. The search operation grew into one of the most extensive in the region's history. Pakistani military aircraft flew grid patterns over the approaches to K2, while Chinese helicopters covered the northern aspects from their side of the border. Ground teams, limited by altitude and terrain, pushed as high as they safely could, using binoculars to scan ice fields and rock faces for debris. International mountaineering expeditions on K2 and nearby peaks were contacted, their camps becoming observation posts where climbers watched for flares or wreckage. Days stretched into weeks, and the operation expanded to cover hundreds of square miles of the most unforgiving landscape on Earth. Nothing was found. No twisted metal scattered across a glacier, no impact crater on a snowfield, no emergency beacon signal cutting through the static. The complete absence of physical evidence baffled investigators who had expected to locate wreckage within days, given the helicopter's last known position and the relatively confined search area. Search teams discovered something else that deepened the mystery. The Polish climbers' camp, reached by a ground team after a dangerous high-altitude push, stood empty. Tents remained pitched and secured against the wind. Climbing equipment lay organized as if the occupants had simply stepped away for a moment. But the climbers themselves were gone. Food supplies were untouched, sleeping bags still laid out, personal items scattered in the casual way of an occupied camp. Yet there were no footprints leading away through the snow, no sign of a struggle or sudden departure, nothing to suggest where two experienced mountaineers might have gone from a location they could not have descended without assistance. The disappearance of both the rescue helicopter and the climbers it had been sent to save created a puzzle that defied conventional explanation. Pakistani authorities conducted extensive interviews and reviewed every aspect of the mission planning, searching for overlooked factors. Weather data was analyzed repeatedly, confirming that conditions had remained stable throughout the critical period. The helicopter's maintenance records showed meticulous upkeep, and Captain Khalil's experience in mountain flying was beyond question. Theories emerged, each attempting to account for the double vanishing, but none could adequately explain the absence of any physical trace. Some suggested a catastrophic structural failure that scattered the helicopter across a wide area, perhaps into crevasses or under avalanche debris that buried all evidence. Yet such failures typically leave some trace, and the sheer scale of the search made it unlikely that everything had been missed. Others pointed to the possibility of military involvement, given the sensitive border region, but no government acknowledged any action, and satellite imagery from the period showed no unusual activity. The description of atmospheric distortion in Khalil's final transmission drew particular attention from those inclined toward less conventional explanations. Several mountaineers on K2 that season reported seeing areas of strangely shimmering air high on the mountain, patches where the atmosphere seemed to bend light in unnatural ways. One Austrian climber described watching the summit appear to ripple as though viewed through heat waves, despite the sub-zero temperatures. For the families of the 6 men who vanished that morning, the lack of answers turned grief into something more difficult to process. Without bodies to bury or wreckage to mark the end, the loss remained suspended in uncertainty. Memorial services were held, but they carried the weight of incompleteness, acknowledging lives lost to something that could not be fully named or understood. Even now, nearly 3 decades later, expeditions on K2 occasionally report unusual phenomena high on the mountain. Climbers speak of moments when the air seems heavier than altitude alone can explain, or sections of the route where compasses spin without reason. The place where Captain Khalil reported the atmospheric distortion has become quietly known among guides, though none can point to it with certainty on a map. The mountain itself offers no answers, its silence as absolute as it was on that clear morning in 1995 when a helicopter and 6 men simply ceased to exist. The Atlantic churned grey and violent off Cape Hatteras on November 3, 1978, as Coast Guard Station Elizabeth City scrambled a rescue helicopter toward a distressed fishing vessel, taking on water 12 miles from shore. Waves reached 15 feet, driven by winds that had been building throughout the afternoon. But conditions remained within operational parameters for the HH-52 Sea Guard and its experienced crew. Lieutenant Commander William Stroud had flown dozens of storm rescues along this treacherous stretch of coastline, and the 3 men with him, co-pilot James Bennett, flight mechanic Robert Hayes, and rescue swimmer Dale Morrison, had trained extensively for exactly this type of mission. The fishing vessel Northern Star had reported engine failure and flooding in the engine compartment, with 6 crew members on board and water rising faster than the pumps could manage. Radio contact with the Northern Star was intermittent but consistent enough to guide the helicopter toward the vessel's position. The crew could see the fishing boat's lights through the storm, a small cluster of brightness against the dark water, and Stroud reported their approach to both the Coast Guard station and the vessel itself. The Northern Star's captain, Michael Torres, confirmed visual contact with the helicopter, describing its searchlights sweeping across the waves as it closed the distance. Torres and his crew prepared to receive the rescue basket, gathering on deck despite the rolling seas and driving rain. What happened in the next few minutes would be witnessed by multiple people, yet would defy every attempt at rational explanation. A wall of fog appeared between the helicopter and the fishing vessel, rising from the ocean surface with impossible speed. Torres would later describe it as unnatural, too thick and too uniform to be ordinary sea mist, moving against the wind rather than with it. The fog was pale grey, almost luminous in the darkness, and it seemed to have defined edges, more like a curtain than a weather phenomenon. The helicopter's lights dimmed as it entered the fog bank, and radio contact degraded to heavy static, punctuated by fragments of transmission, too distorted to understand. On the Northern Star, the crew watched the searchlight glow diffusely through the fog for perhaps 30 seconds before it vanished entirely, swallowed by the unnatural mist. Torres attempted to maintain radio contact, calling repeatedly for the Coast Guard helicopter, but received no response. The fog persisted for several minutes, hanging motionless despite the wind that should have dispersed it, before beginning to dissipate as suddenly as it had formed. As visibility cleared, the fishing vessel's crew saw something that would haunt their recollections for years afterward. The helicopter emerged briefly from the thinning fog, perhaps 200 yards from its previous position, flying in an oddly steady hover. Through the aircraft's windows clearly visible in the boat's spotlights, the cockpit appeared empty. No pilot sat at the controls, no crew members were visible in the cabin, and the helicopter maintained its position with an eerie stability that seemed impossible without human guidance. Torres shouted to his crew, several of whom confirmed they saw the same thing. An unmanned helicopter hanging in the storm as though suspended by invisible wires. Before anyone on the Northern Star could react further, the helicopter banked sharply and accelerated into another patch of fog that materialized to the east. The aircraft disappeared into this second fog bank and never emerged. Radio calls went unanswered, and within minutes, a different Coast Guard helicopter, dispatched when the first lost contact, arrived to complete the rescue of the Northern Star's crew. By then, the strange fog had dissipated completely, leaving only storm and darkness. The search for the missing HH-52 began immediately, with multiple aircraft and surface vessels combing the waters off Cape Hatteras throughout the night and following days. The area where the helicopter had vanished was relatively shallow, no more than 60 feet deep in most places, and previous searches had successfully located downed aircraft in similar conditions. Yet nothing was found. No debris floating on the surface, no oil slick marking a crash site, no emergency locator beacon signal cutting through the radio frequencies. Divers explored the seabed in the most likely impact zones, finding only sand and the scattered remains of much older wrecks. The graveyard of the Atlantic had claimed countless vessels over the centuries, but rarely with such complete absence of evidence. Torres and his crew were interviewed extensively, their accounts documented and cross-referenced. All 6 men described the fog wall in nearly identical terms, emphasizing its unnatural appearance and behavior. Their descriptions of the unmanned helicopter were consistent across every witness, despite being questioned separately. Coast Guard investigators found no reason to doubt their credibility, yet struggled to reconcile their testimony with any known phenomenon. The official report, when finally issued, attributed the loss to unknown causes, noting the unusual weather conditions but offering no definitive explanation for the helicopter's disappearance or the witnesses' observations. In the years that followed, other Coast Guard pilots flying missions off Cape Hatteras occasionally reported strange fog formations that appeared without meteorological cause, and a few described moments of radio interference that seemed to carry faint, distorted voices, speaking in patterns that resembled emergency transmissions. None of these incidents resulted in disappearances, but they contributed to a growing unease among air crews operating in the region. Some pilots began referring to certain coordinates informally as cold zones, areas where instruments occasionally malfunctioned and where the atmosphere felt different in ways difficult to articulate. The families of the 4 lost crew members held memorial services. But like so many who lose loved ones to the sea, they were left with questions that the ocean refused to answer. For those who had witnessed the empty helicopter hovering impossibly in the storm, the memory never faded into comfortable distance. Torres in particular spoke of it rarely, but when pressed, he would describe with unwavering certainty what he and his crew had seen. A helicopter with no one flying it, suspended in a storm that should have torn it from the sky, before it vanished into fog that had no natural right to exist. The waters off Cape Hatteras continue to take their toll on vessels and aircraft, earning their grim reputation through centuries of wrecks and disappearances. Whether the HH-52 and his crew joined that long list through simple misfortune or something more inexplicable remains unresolved, though those who know the full account find it difficult to accept the simplest explanation. Summer sunlight glinted off the snow-covered peaks above Zermatt, Switzerland, on August the 12th, 2003, as an Air Zermatt rescue helicopter prepared for what should have been a routine avalanche victim recovery. The company, renowned throughout Europe for high-altitude mountain rescue operations, had dispatched one of their most experienced crews, pilot Andreas Müller, with over 15 years navigating the treacherous air currents around the Matterhorn, co-pilot Stefan Gerber, flight physician Dr. Claudia Hartmann, and rescue specialist Thomas Becker. An avalanche earlier that morning had swept two climbers down the north face of the Dent Blanche, and their climbing partners had managed to establish radio contact, confirming both victims were alive, but injured and unable to move from where the snow had deposited them at approximately 12,400 feet. The briefing at the Air Zermatt base in Zermatt was thorough, but unremarkable. Weather conditions were excellent, with clear skies and light winds that made flying at altitude far easier than usual for the region. The helicopter systems had been checked and confirmed operational, and the crew reviewed the approach route and extraction procedures with practiced efficiency. Dr. Hartmann prepared medical supplies for likely injuries associated with avalanche burial, while Becker organized the rescue harnesses and equipment needed to evacuate victims from steep terrain. By all accounts, the mission fell well within the parameters of operations the team conducted regularly throughout the alpine season. The helicopter lifted off at 9:47 a.m., according to base logs, and climbed steadily toward the Dent Blanche. Radio contact remained clear and consistent as the crew reported their progress, and ground control tracked the aircraft's position through standard monitoring systems. Müller confirmed visual contact with the avalanche debris field at 10:02 a.m. and began his approach to the site, circling to assess the best insertion point for the rescue team. The last transmission received by ground control came at 10:09 a.m., with Müller reporting that Becker was preparing to descend on the winch to reach the victims. The communication was calm and routine, showing no indication of trouble. Then the helicopter disappeared from radio contact and radar tracking. Controllers at the Air Zermatt base attempted repeatedly to re-establish communication, initially assuming they were dealing with a simple equipment malfunction or interference from the mountain terrain. When 15 minutes passed without response, concern escalated to alarm. Other aircraft in the region were contacted to see if they could establish visual or radio contact, and a second Air Zermatt helicopter was scrambled to search for the missing crew. The avalanche victims' climbing partners watching from a higher position on the mountain, reported that they had seen the rescue helicopter hovering near the debris field, but then it had seemed to vanish into thin air despite the crystal clear visibility. For 6 hours, the helicopter and its crew were simply gone. Ground control maintained continuous attempts at contact, cycling through all possible frequencies. Search aircraft crisscrossed the area, expecting at any moment to spot wreckage on a glacier or evidence of a crash landing. Mountain rescue teams on the ground prepared for the possibility of having to mount a search operation for the searchers. Families were notified that the crew was missing, and Swiss aviation authorities were alerted to what appeared to be a catastrophic incident with no witnesses and no trace. At 4:23 p.m., the helicopter's radar signature reappeared on tracking screens in exactly the position where it had vanished 6 hours earlier. Controllers, stunned by the sudden return, immediately established radio contact. Müller's voice came through clearly, sounding confused but not distressed, reporting that they had successfully recovered both avalanche victims and were preparing to return to base. When ground control informed him that he had been missing for 6 hours, there was a long pause before Müller responded that his chronometer showed the mission had lasted 45 minutes from departure to completion. The helicopter returned to base with the 2 rescued climbers, both alive and receiving medical attention from Dr. Hartmann during the flight. Upon landing, the crew emerged visibly confused by the insistence that hours had passed. Each crew member's watch showed times consistent with a 45-minute mission. The helicopter's onboard clock system displayed 10 to 1:54 a.m., despite the base clock reading after 4:30 p.m. More disturbing were the physical anomalies immediately apparent on the aircraft itself. The helicopter's exterior, particularly the rotor blades and fuselage, bore heavy frost patterns and ice crystals that had no business existing on a shy machine that had been flying in the warm summer air. The ice formations were elaborate, intricate, showing the kind of growth that typically required hours of exposure to sub-zero temperatures. Medical examinations of the crew were conducted immediately, searching for any physiological evidence that might explain the time discrepancy. Body temperature, heart rate patterns, metabolic markers, all suggested that the crew had experienced the brief mission they remembered rather than 6 hours of physical activity. Their fatigue levels were consistent with a short flight, not an extended operation. Blood tests showed no signs of hypoxia, dehydration, or other conditions that might explain altered perception of time. Yet the ice on the helicopter told a different story, one that suggested prolonged exposure to conditions that should not have existed at all in August above the Swiss Alps. The avalanche victims presented their own puzzle. Medical assessment revealed injuries and physiological stress consistent with having been buried in snow for significantly longer than the few hours since the avalanche occurred. Tissue damage, hypothermia progression, even the cellular changes visible in their blood work suggested they had been trapped for nearly a full day, despite eyewitness accounts placing the avalanche that morning. Their own recollection of time was hazy, fragmented by trauma and cold, but they described waiting for rescue far longer than the timeline allowed. Swiss aviation authorities conducted an extensive investigation, reviewing every aspect of the mission. The helicopter's maintenance records were flawless, its equipment functioning properly both before and after the incident. The crew's experience and competence were beyond question. Weather data confirmed the stable conditions throughout the day. Yet the investigators could not reconcile the 6-hour gap in tracking and communication with the crew's 45-minute subjective experience. Nor could they explain the ice formations that defied the season and altitude. The official report acknowledged these contradictions without resolving them, listing the incident as an unexplained temporal anomaly pending further study. Muller and his crew returned to flying after the investigation, though they spoke little about the experience publicly. Privately, among trusted colleagues, they maintained absolute certainty about their perception of time during the mission. The 45 minutes they remembered felt real, concrete, unquestionable. The physical evidence of 6 missing hours and impossible ice seemed to belong to a different reality entirely, one that had somehow overlaid their own experience without their awareness. Air Zermatt continues to operate in the region, its pilots among the most skilled in the world at high-altitude rescue. The incident has become a quiet legend within the alpine rescue community, discussed in careful terms that acknowledge both the impossible elements and the undeniable professionalism of those involved. Whether time itself fractured that morning above Zermatt, or whether crew and aircraft briefly slipped into some parallel duration, remains a question that the mountains themselves seem content to leave unanswered. The morning air hung crisp and cold over Mount Rainier on October 29, 1987, as a U.S. Army Chinook helicopter lifted off from Fort Lewis for a simulated mountain rescue exercise. The massive twin-rotor aircraft, operated by the 4th Battalion, 123rd Aviation Regiment, carried a crew of 8, including pilots, Chief Warrant Officer David Brennan and Captain Jennifer Holbrook, along with 6 soldiers training in high-altitude extraction techniques. The exercise was part of routine preparation for potential real-world missions in the Cascade Range, where military and civilian rescues occasionally required the Chinook's heavy lift capabilities. Weather conditions were favorable, with scattered clouds and light winds, and the flight plan called for a series of practice landings and hover operations on the mountain's lower glaciers. Radio communications during the first hour of the exercise were standard and professional. The Chinook completed several practice approaches to predetermined coordinates, with the crew calling out each maneuver and confirming successful execution. Ground controllers at Fort Lewis tracked the helicopter's progress without concern, noting the precision with which Brennan navigated the complex air currents around the mountain's massive slopes. At 10:47 a.m., the aircraft reported beginning its final approach to a landing zone on the Nisqually Glacier at approximately 8,200 feet, where the training team would simulate a casualty evacuation before returning to base. The transmission that followed was brief, but carried enough strangeness to make controllers lean closer to their equipment. Holbrook's voice all came through describing electrical anomalies affecting multiple instruments simultaneously. Compass readings were spinning, altimeters fluctuating wildly between readings that differed by thousands of feet, and the radio itself was producing interference that sounded almost musical, a rising and falling tone that had no business existing on a military frequency. Brennan's voice cut in, steadier but tense, requesting immediate clearance to abort the exercise and return to base. Before ground control could respond, The radar signature representing the Chinook split into 3 distinct returns, each appearing to move in a different direction for perhaps 5 seconds before all 3 vanished from the screens entirely. Emergency procedures activated immediately. Multiple attempts to raise the crew on all frequencies produced only silence. Fighter jets from McCord Air Force Base were scrambled for visual reconnaissance, and within 2 hours, a full search and rescue operation involving both military and civilian assets had mobilized across the southern and western approaches to Mount Rainier. The weather remained clear, visibility excellent, yet no one could locate any sign of the missing Chinook or its crew. Search aircraft flew low over glaciers and ridgelines, their crews expecting to spot wreckage or survivors, but finding only unbroken expanses of snow and ice. The search continued for weeks, expanding to cover the entire mountain and extending into valleys where the helicopter might have attempted an emergency landing. Ground teams pushed onto the glaciers, using probes and technical equipment to search for buried wreckage. The Chinook's emergency locator beacon should have activated upon impact, broadcasting its position to rescue services, yet no signal was ever detected. Search coordinators reviewed radar data repeatedly, studying the moment when the single return split into 3, but could find no technical explanation for such a malfunction in what had been, by all accounts, properly functioning equipment. 3 months later, a National Park Service patrol on the Nisqually Glacier discovered something impossible. Protruding from the ice at an elevation matching the Chinook's intended landing zone were 2 landing skids, heavy metal struts designed to support the helicopter's weight. They stood upright, embedded in the glacier, as though the aircraft had set down normally before somehow vanishing and leaving only these pieces behind. No other wreckage could be found in the immediate area, no gouges in the ice suggesting impact, no debris field of the kind that accompanies catastrophic failure. Just 2 landing skids, alone and unexplainable. The skids were recovered and transported to military facilities for analysis. Visual examination confirmed they were components from a CH-47 Chinook, matching the specifications of the missing aircraft. What baffled investigators was the condition of the metal itself and the ice surrounding it. Glaciologists studying the ice formation around the skids determined that the struts had been in place for far longer than 3 months. The patterns of ice growth, the depth of embedding, the crystalline structures that had formed around the metal all suggested a minimum of 30 years of glacier movement and accumulation. Yet the helicopter had vanished only months earlier, and the skids themselves showed wear and weathering consistent with decades of exposure to the elements. No bodies were found, no additional wreckage. No explanation emerged that could account for landing skids aging decades, while the rest of the aircraft and its crew disappeared without leaving a mark on the ice. Military investigators documented the findings with careful precision, but reached no conclusions about what had occurred on the mountain that October morning. The official record listed the crew as missing, presumed dead, and the incident was classified as unresolved. Among the Puyallup and Yakama peoples, whose traditions are deeply connected to Mount Rainier, there was little surprise at what had happened. The mountain, known in their languages as Tahoma, has long been understood as a place where the physical and spiritual worlds overlap in ways that defy outside explanation. Stories passed through generations speak of the mountain taking people who venture onto its slopes, not through accident or natural disaster, but through means that belong to the mountain itself. Park rangers and experienced mountaineers familiar with these accounts noted that the Nisqually Glacier, where the skids were found, appears in several such stories as a threshold place, though what it serves as a threshold to remains unclear. The landing skids were eventually placed in storage at a military depot, catalogued evidence of a mystery no investigation could penetrate. Whether they are remnants of a helicopter that existed simultaneously in multiple time periods, or whether they aged in ways that physics cannot yet explain, they remain the only physical trace of 8 people who lifted off one autumn morning and encountered something on Mount Rainier that erased them from ordinary existence. A winter storm battered the North Sea oil platforms on January the 14th, 2001, as a Norwegian Air Force Sea King helicopter launched from Sola Air Station toward a medical emergency on the Statfjord A platform, 80 miles offshore. Waves reached heights that threatened to overwhelm even the massive platform's stabilization systems, and wind gusts exceeded 40 knots, conditions that made offshore operations dangerous but not impossible for the experienced crew of Squadron 330. Lieutenant Magnus Olsen had piloted countless medical evacuations from North Sea platforms during his 12 years with the Royal Norwegian Air Force, and his crew, co-pilot Erik Johansen, flight engineer Lars Mikkelsen, and rescue medic Kari Strand had trained extensively for exactly these conditions. The patient, a 42-year-old platform worker named Bjorn Harland, had suffered what appeared to be a severe cardiac event and required immediate transport to Stavanger University Hospital. Contact with the Statfjord A was maintained throughout the helicopter's approach, with platform personnel providing updates on Harland's deteriorating condition and confirming that the helipad was prepared to receive the aircraft despite the pitching seas. The flight out had been rough but manageable, the Sea King buffeted by winds, but responding well to Olsen's experienced handling. At 3:34 p.m., the helicopter reported beginning its landing approach to the platform, and rig supervisor Gunnar Solberg confirmed visual contact with the aircraft's navigation lights through the storm. What Solberg and 7 other platform workers witnessed in the next few minutes would be documented in written statements that matched with unsettling consistency. As the Sea King descended toward the helipad, a mist began to form around the aircraft. The rig workers initially assumed it was sea spray driven upward by the wind, but the vapor appeared to glow faintly with a greenish tint that had no natural source. The glow intensified as the helicopter settled onto the landing pad until the mist surrounded the entire aircraft in what Solberg would describe as a luminous cocoon. The phenomenon persisted for perhaps 90 seconds, during which radio communication with the helicopter degraded to static, before the mist dissipated as suddenly as it had formed. The Sea King sat on the helipad with its rotors still turning, apparently undamaged, but the crew's responses to radio calls seemed delayed and confused. Harland was loaded into the aircraft with assistance from Strand, the rescue medic, who moved with mechanical efficiency but spoke little. Platform personnel noted that the crew members seemed disoriented, their movements slightly off in timing, their responses to questions taking longer than normal, as though they were translating from another language. The helicopter lifted off at 3:52 p.m., according to platform logs, and disappeared into the storm on its return flight to Sola. Radio contact during the return flight was sporadic, with Olsen acknowledging transmissions but offering little additional communication beyond confirming their heading and altitude. Upon landing at Sola Air Station 40 minutes later, the helicopter's crew emerged visibly shaken and struggling to articulate what they had experienced. Each crew member described gaps in their memory of the flight, periods where their recollection simply stopped and then resumed without any sense of time having passed. Olsen could remember departing the station and could remember landing back at the station, but the entire middle portion of the mission existed only in fragments, disconnected images that refused to form a coherent narrative. The sensation they described was not amnesia in the conventional sense, more like trying to recall a dream that had already begun fading upon waking. They knew they had flown to the Startfjord A and back, knew they had completed the mission, but could not access the memories of doing so. The medical team waiting to receive Harland immediately recognized that something was wrong. The patient appeared far older than his documented age, his skin showing advanced wrinkling and age spots that had not been present in the photographs provided by the platform medical staff just hours earlier. His hair, reported as dark brown with scattered grey, had turned completely white. More troubling were the medical readings taken in the emergency department. Harland's cellular structure, examined through blood work and tissue samples, showed markers consistent with advanced aging. His telomeres, the protective caps on chromosomes that shorten with age, were dramatically reduced compared to samples taken during his last routine medical examination just 3 months prior. Cardiovascular tissue showed degradation patterns typically associated with men 2 or 3 decades older. The attending physicians, initially suspecting some rare accelerated aging disorder, consulted specialists in genetics and cellular biology. Each examination confirmed the impossible. Harland's body had aged by what appeared to be 20 to 30 years during the 40-minute helicopter flight from the oil platform to the hospital. His confusion upon regaining consciousness was profound. He insisted he had just been working his shift when the chest pain started, could not understand why everyone looked different than he remembered, and grew agitated when shown his reflection in a mirror. The face that stared back at him was decades older than the one he knew. Psychological evaluations of the helicopter crew were conducted over the following weeks. Each member underwent extensive testing, searching for evidence of shared delusion, trauma-induced dissociation, or exposure to environmental contaminants that might explain their memory gaps. The results showed no abnormalities beyond the specific amnesia related to the flight. Brain scans revealed no damage, no signs of stroke or seizure, nothing that would account for the selective loss of memory. What made the case more difficult to dismiss was the absolute consistency in their descriptions of what they could not remember. The gaps occurred at precisely the same points in the mission for all 4 crew members, and their fragmented recollections, when compared, aligned perfectly in the few details they retained. The investigation by Norwegian aviation authorities was thorough and careful, examining every aspect of the mission from mechanical systems to weather conditions. The Sea King's maintenance records showed no deficiencies, and post-flight inspection revealed no damage or unusual wear. The glowing mist witnessed by the oil rig workers defied meteorological explanation. Sea spray does not glow green, and no known atmospheric phenomenon matched the descriptions provided by multiple independent witnesses on the platform. Chemical analysis of the helicopter's exterior revealed no unusual residues or compounds that might explain the glow or its effects. Harlan survived the cardiac event, but never recovered from the aging that had occurred during his transport. His family struggled to reconcile the middle-aged man they had said goodbye to that morning with the elderly man who returned. Medical monitoring in the months that followed showed no further acceleration of aging, suggesting that whatever had affected him was limited to the duration of the helicopter flight. He retired from offshore work, unable to perform the physical labor his aged body could no longer sustain, and avoided discussing the incident except in the most general terms. The confusion and displacement he felt never fully resolved, as though part of him remained convinced that the life he remembered having just hours before being evacuated was the real one, and the decades that appeared to have passed were the illusion. The crew of Squadron 330 continued flying after completing mandatory psychological assessments, though they spoke little about the mission publicly. Among their fellow pilots, however, the incident became known in quiet discussions, a reminder that the North Sea, for all its routine dangers, occasionally produced events that transcended ordinary hazard. Whether the glowing mist was a cause or merely a visible marker of something more fundamental remains unknown, as does the mechanism that could selectively age one person while leaving others untouched, or steal memories from all while leaving their ability to function intact. Clear skies stretched over the Chilean Andes on March 8, 1999, as a rescue helicopter departed from Santiago to search for two hikers overdue from a trek near Aconcagua. The Bell 212, operated by the Chilean Air Force's Grupo de Aviación Nerón 10, carried pilot Captain Roberto Fuentes, co-pilot Lieutenant Carlos Vega, and rescue specialist Sergeant Diego Campos, all experienced in mountain operations across the challenging terrain of the Central Andes. The hikers, Swedish nationals Henrik Lindström and Eva Bergström, had been expected to return from their planned 5-day circuit 3 days earlier, and when they failed to make a contact, the tour company that had arranged their permits contacted Chilean authorities. Weather conditions had been stable throughout the period, and search coordinators were optimistic about locating the pair before nightfall. The helicopter followed a systematic search pattern, covering the valleys and ridgelines along the hikers' documented route. Fuentes maintained regular radio contact with Santiago Control, reporting negative sightings at each checkpoint as they worked their way deeper into the mountains. The visibility was exceptional, allowing the crew to scan vast areas of terrain with clarity unusual for the region. At 11:18 a.m., the helicopter reported reaching the northern boundary of the search zone and requested clearance to expand the pattern westward before beginning the return flight. Santiago Control approved the extension, and Fuentes acknowledged with his usual professional brevity. That transmission marked the last contact anyone would have with the aircraft for 72 hours. The disappearance of the rescue helicopter transformed a search for two missing hikers into a far more urgent operation involving multiple aircraft and coordination between Chilean and Argentine authorities. The Bell 212 had simply stopped responding to radio calls and vanished from radar tracking in an area where coverage should have been continuous. Fighter jets from the Chilean Air Force conducted high-speed reconnaissance flights over the region, their pilots reporting no visual contact with the helicopter or any sign of crash debris. The weather remained clear, eliminating the possibility the sudden storms had forced the aircraft down. Search efforts continued around the clock, with crews expecting that at any moment they would locate the helicopter and its crew, either landed safely in some remote valley or tragically scattered across a mountainside. On the morning of March 11th, the helicopter reappeared. Ground observers at a small airstrip near Mendoza, Argentina, nearly 200 miles south of the search zone, reported a Chilean Air Force helicopter approaching for landing. The aircraft set down normally, and when customs officials and Argentine military personnel approached, they found the crew confused but apparently unharmed. Fuentes insisted that only 4 hours had elapsed since their departure from Santiago, that they had been searching for the Swedish hikers and had simply continued south when initial search areas proved fruitless. When informed that 3 days had passed and that they were in Argentina, far from their intended search zone, the crew's confusion deepened into something approaching shock. The helicopter's fuel gauges provided the first concrete evidence that something impossible had occurred. The Bell 2 Tuanpum's tanks held enough fuel for approximately 4 hours of flight time, and the gauges showed the level consistent with the brief operation the crew remembered. Yet the distance from their last known position to their landing site in Mendoza was over 200 miles, a flight that should have consumed every drop of fuel and then some. Even if the helicopter had flown in a direct line at maximum range speed, which neither its fuel capacity nor the mountainous terrain would have allowed, the aircraft should have been empty and unflyable. Instead, the tanks held sufficient fuel for another hour of operation. Argentine authorities detained the crew and aircraft pending investigation, a process complicated by the international nature of the incident and the sheer impossibility of reconciling the physical evidence with any rational explanation. Each crew member was interviewed extensively, and their accounts matched with the kind of consistency that made fabrication unlikely. All 3 men remembered the same sequence of events: departing Santiago, conducting search patterns, seeing no sign of the hikers, deciding to extend southward, and then landing in what they believed was still Chile. None could explain the 72-hour gap or how they had traveled a distance their fuel capacity should not have permitted. Medical examinations revealed another anomaly. The crew's wristwatches, worn by all 3 men, had stopped at precisely 11:23 a.m. on March 8th, 5 minutes after their last radio transmission. The watches were mechanical, not electronic, reducing the possibility of electromagnetic interference. When wound and restarted, all 3 began keeping normal time again, showing no damage or malfunction. The synchronization of the stoppage, down to the minute, suggested a shared event rather than 3 independent mechanical failures. The Chilean Air Force conducted its own investigation upon the crew's return, examining the helicopter thoroughly for any anomalies that might explain the incident. Flight recorders showed data consistent with a 4-hour mission, despite 3 days having passed in the outside world. Fuel consumption records matched the crew's perception of time rather than the calendar. Even the engine hours logged by the aircraft's maintenance computer reflected only the brief flight the crew remembered, not the extended journey required to reach Mendoza. It was as though the helicopter and its occupants had existed in a compressed timeline while the rest of the world continued at normal speed. The Swedish hikers were never found. Expanded searches over the following weeks covered every accessible area of their planned route and beyond. No equipment, no remains, no trace of their passage emerged from the mountains. It remained unclear whether their disappearance and the helicopter's temporal anomaly were connected or simply two separate mysteries occurring in the same region. Some investigators suggested that whatever force had affected the rescue helicopter might have taken the hikers first, though this explanation required accepting phenomena that conventional physics could not accommodate. Captain Fuentes and his crew eventually returned to flight duty after psychological assessments confirmed they were fit to fly. They maintained absolute certainty about their experience, insisting that no amount of external evidence could alter their memory of those 4 hours. The contradiction between their subjective experience and objective reality never resolved, leaving them in the uncomfortable position of knowing that something happened while being unable to explain what. For them, the flight remained exactly as they remembered it, a routine search operation that somehow transported them across space and time in ways that defied measurement. The Andes have long held a reputation for swallowing those who ventured too deep into their valleys and onto their peaks. Whether through avalanche, exposure, or simple misjudgment, the mountains claim lives with regularity. What happened to the Chilean rescue helicopter and the Swedish hikers it sought suggests that some disappearances in those vast ranges may involve forces beyond the natural dangers climbers prepare for. The mountains keep their secrets well, and the explanation for how a helicopter could fly 200 miles on fuel for 50, or how 3 days could pass in 4 hours, remains locked somewhere in the silent peaks that witnessed it. Heat shimmered over the red earth of the Northern Territory on February 22, 1983, as a Royal Flying Doctor Service helicopter touched down at a remote cattle station to evacuate a critically ill stockman. The temperature had already climbed past 40 degrees Celsius by mid-morning, and the air above the dusty airstrip wavered in patterns that made distant features appear to float and shift. Pilot Graham Mitchell had flown this route dozens of times during his 8 years with the RFDS, and the 3 crew members accompanying him, flight nurse Sarah Donaldson, Dr. Peter Henshaw, and paramedic James Keating, had collectively spent decades providing emergency medical care across the vast emptiness of Australia's interior. The patient, 53-year-old station manager Colin Burke, had suffered what appeared to be a severe appendicitis that had progressed toward rupture, requiring immediate transport to Darwin Hospital for surgery. The station's manager, Burke's wife Margaret, had made the emergency call just after dawn, describing symptoms that had worsened overnight from manageable pain to acute distress. By the time the helicopter arrived, Burke was conscious, but feverish, his abdomen rigid with the classic signs of peritonitis. Dr. Henshaw conducted a rapid assessment, confirmed the working diagnosis, and supervised Burke's transfer into the helicopter on a stretcher. Margaret Burke watched as the aircraft lifted off, its rotors kicking up red dust that hung in the still air long after the helicopter had diminished to a speck against the pale sky. The flight to Darwin should have taken 90 minutes, routine by RFDS standards, following established corridors over landscapes the crew knew intimately. The helicopter never arrived. Radio contact, maintained through the first 20 minutes of flight with routine position reports, simply ceased without warning or distress call. Air traffic controllers in Darwin attempted to re-establish communication, initially assuming they were dealing with radio equipment failure. But when the helicopter failed to appear within its expected arrival window, emergency protocols activated. The vastness of the Northern Territory made search operations challenging, even in ideal conditions, but the clear weather and known flight path should have made locating a downed helicopter relatively straightforward. Search aircraft departed within hours, flying low over the scrubland and following the highway that roughly paralleled the helicopter's route, expecting to spot wreckage or an emergency landing site. Days passed without discovery. The search expanded to cover hundreds of square miles on either side of the projected flight path, incorporating both aerial reconnaissance and ground teams traveling along remote tracks in four-wheel drive vehicles. Aboriginal communities throughout the region were contacted, their members asked to watch for any sign of the missing aircraft. The likelihood of survivors diminished with each day given the extreme heat and lack of water in the areas being searched. After a week, officials privately acknowledged that they were now searching for wreckage and bodies rather than living crew and patient. 3 weeks after the disappearance, a routine patrol aircraft spotted the helicopter sitting in open desert approximately 40 miles west of the planned flight route. The aircraft appeared intact, resting upright on its skids, as though it had simply landed in the middle of nowhere. The pilot reported no visible damage, no crash debris scattered around the site, just the helicopter sitting alone in terrain that offered no obvious reason for an emergency landing. Ground teams reached the location within hours, approaching with the expectation of finding bodies preserved by the dry heat. Inside the helicopter, all 4 crew members were found unconscious but alive, their vital signs weak but stable. Colin Burke lay on the stretcher where he had been secured 3 weeks earlier, his body showing no signs of life. The crew was severely dehydrated, their skin papery and lips cracked, showing the effects of prolonged exposure without water. Yet their level of dehydration was not consistent with 3 weeks of desert heat. Medical assessments suggested perhaps 3 to 4 days without fluids. Impossible given the timeline, but evident in their physiological state. More perplexing was the absence of the extreme weight loss that should have accompanied 3 weeks without food or water. Their bodies showed stress, certainly, but not the catastrophic breakdown expected from such prolonged deprivation. Emergency medical care was provided on site, with intravenous fluids administered and the crew stabilized for transport to Darwin Hospital. None regained consciousness during the initial rescue, and when they finally woke hours later in hospital beds, they had no memory of the 3 weeks that had passed. Each crew member's last clear recollection was of routine flight operations, checking instruments, monitoring Burke's condition, maintaining their heading toward Darwin. The next thing any of them remembered was waking in the hospital, confused and disoriented, unable to account for the gap between takeoff and awakening. Colin Burke's death presented its own mystery. The autopsy revealed that he had not died from appendicitis or peritonitis, despite those conditions being present. The cause of death was listed as extreme cellular breakdown affecting multiple organ systems simultaneously, a pattern that matched no known disease or toxin. His tissues showed degradation that suggested rapid systemic failure, but the mechanism remained unexplained. The pathologist noted in the report that the cellular damage resembled radiation exposure at lethal doses, yet there was no source of such radiation in the helicopter or the surrounding environment, and the crew showed no similar effects. The helicopter's flight data recorder, examined by aviation investigators, provided perhaps the most unsettling evidence. The device had functioned normally for the first 20 minutes of flight, recording routine operational parameters, altitude, speed, engine performance, all within expected ranges. Then the data simply stopped. Not corrupted, not damaged, just blank, as though the helicopter had ceased to exist for the missing weeks before the recording resumed briefly when rescue teams arrived. The blank period aligned precisely with the time the helicopter was missing, offering electronic confirmation of a void that should not have been possible. Aboriginal elders from the Larrakia and Tiwi communities, when consulted, spoke of song lines that sometimes became disrupted, places where the dreaming paths crossed in ways that could trap travelers between worlds. They described sections of country where time moved differently, where the rules governing ordinary existence became fluid. Several elders identified the area where the helicopter was found as being near such a junction, a place they avoided during certain seasons or under particular conditions. Their knowledge, passed through generations, suggested that what had happened to the RFDS crew was not unprecedented, merely rare and dangerous. Mitchell, Donaldson, Henshaw, and Keating never returned to flying after the incident. Medical evaluations cleared them physically, but the psychological impact of losing 3 weeks without memory proved too significant. They spoke little about the experience publicly, preferring to leave it as an unexplained gap in their lives rather than something to be examined endlessly. The Royal Flying Doctor Service continued its operations across the outback, though pilots began paying closer attention to the stories told by Aboriginal peoples about places where country behaved in unexpected ways. The helicopter itself was eventually returned to service after thorough inspection revealed no mechanical defects. Whether it carried some residual trace of wherever it had been during those lost weeks remained a question without answer, though some crew members who flew it afterward reported a lingering sense of unease, a feeling that the aircraft remembered something its instruments could not record. The outback, vast and ancient, keeps its mysteries close. And what happened to the RFDS helicopter during those 3 weeks exists now only in the blank spaces of a flight recorder and the absent memories of those who lived through it. Mist clung to the peaks of Ben Nevis on September 17, 1991, as a volunteer mountain rescue helicopter lifted off from Fort William following an automated distress beacon signal detected on the mountain's northern approaches. The civilian crew, pilot Donald McLeod and rescue coordinator Fiona Campbell, along with volunteer climbers Alistair Ross and Jenny Patterson, had responded to hundreds of such calls during the summer climbing season. Most resulted in straightforward evacuations of injured or exhausted climbers, and the beacon's activation suggested someone was in serious enough distress to trigger their emergency locator. The signal coordinates, placed the beacon at approximately 3,200 feet on a rocky shelf accessed by a popular but challenging route, and weather conditions, while misty, remained within safe flying parameters. McLeod guided the helicopter toward the beacon's position with practiced efficiency, the aircraft rising through layers of cloud that wrapped the mountain in shifting grey. Radio contact with Fort William remained clear, and the beacon's signal grew stronger as they approached, its steady electronic pulse providing precise navigation even through the limited visibility. Campbell prepared rescue equipment, while Ross and Patterson, both experienced mountaineers, readied themselves for a potential technical extraction if the injured climber was in difficult terrain. The helicopter arrived at the coordinates within 20 minutes of departure, hovering above the shelf while the crew scanned for the person who had activated the beacon. The shelf was empty. Ross rappelled down to conduct a ground search, moving carefully across the uneven rock while the others watched from above. He located the beacon within minutes, finding it wedged between two boulders as though deliberately placed rather than dropped during a fall. The device itself immediately struck him as wrong. The casing was weathered and scratched, showing years of exposure, and the model was one that had been discontinued decades earlier, long before modern digital locators became standard. Ross retrieved the beacon and signaled for extraction, his confusion evident even through the hand gestures visible to those in the helicopter. No footprints marked the surrounding area, no climbing equipment, no sign that anyone had been there recently, despite the beacon's active transmission. Back aboard the helicopter, the crew examined the device with growing unease. Campbell recognized the model from old training manuals, a type commonly used in the 1960s before being phased out due to reliability issues. Yet this beacon had been functioning perfectly, transmitting on frequencies that modern rescue services still monitored, despite the equipment itself being obsolete. McLeod radioed Fort William to report the situation, describing the abandoned beacon and the absence of any climber. Controllers acknowledged the report and cleared the helicopter to return to base, noting the unusual circumstances for later investigation. During the flight back, something shifted in the crew's awareness. There was no dramatic moment, no obvious transition, but when the helicopter landed at Fort William, ground crew and medical personnel waiting to receive a potential casualty immediately asked about the fifth person visible in the cabin. McLeod, Campbell, Ross, and Patterson looked at each other in confusion before turning to see someone sitting in the rear compartment, a figure in climbing gear none of them clearly remembered boarding. The person appeared male, perhaps in his 30s, wearing clothing that seemed slightly dated in cut and fabric. His face remained oddly indistinct in their perception, features that seemed to shift when looked at directly, making it impossible to focus on specific details. Hospital staff approached as the crew disembarked, ready to assess the rescued climber. The figure moved with them, walking between Ross and Patterson as though they were assisting him. Yet none of the crew could later recall deciding to evacuate him or conducting any assessment of his condition. Security cameras at the landing site, reviewed afterward, showed the crew walking from the helicopter, accompanied by what appeared to be a fifth person. Though the image was oddly distorted, the figure's form flickering in and out of clear resolution, as though the recording equipment struggled to capture something not quite solid. At Fort William Medical Center, the mysterious passenger was admitted for evaluation, though the intake paperwork remained incomplete, forms filled out with information no one could later verify. Nursing staff described performing standard examinations, yet their recollections of the specifics remained vague, details that should have been routine slipping away when they tried to articulate what they had observed. The patient was assigned to a private room for overnight observation, and staff noted his presence during evening rounds. By morning, the room stood empty. No one had seen him leave. No security footage captured his departure, and the main exits had been monitored throughout the night, without exception. What remained in the room told a story that deepened rather than resolved the mystery. The clothing left behind, examined by police investigators, dated to the 1960s based on fabric composition, manufacturing techniques, and style. Labels inside the garments showed brands that had ceased production 30 years earlier. A rucksack found under the bed contained climbing equipment of similar vintage, including rope of a type no longer manufactured and carabiners matching designs from the same era as the distress beacon. All items showed wear consistent with use, yet they had been preserved in near-perfect condition, free from the decay that 3 decades should have imposed. The helicopter crew underwent extensive questioning, each member interviewed separately to prevent contamination of their accounts. The consistency of their statements was remarkable in describing what they could not remember. None could recall the passenger's face with any clarity. None could specify when he had boarded or how the decision to evacuate him had been made. Yet all 4 maintained absolute certainty that someone had been present. Ground crew and medical staff provided identical descriptions of encountering a 5th person, corroborating the crew's experience despite the shared inability to retain clear details. Scottish Mountain Rescue investigated the incident as thoroughly as resources allowed, but conventional explanations failed to account for the evidence. The beacon's age and the matching vintage of the abandoned clothing suggested a connection to someone from decades earlier, possibly a climber who had disappeared on Ben Nevis during the 1960s. Historical records showed several unsolved disappearances from that era, climbers who had set out and never returned. But no missing persons reports matched the vague descriptions the crew could provide. The beacon itself, when tested, continued to function properly despite its age, transmitting a signal that should have required modern battery technology the device did not possess. Among those familiar with the Highlands, the incident added to a long tradition of unexplained encounters in the mountains. Ben Nevis, as Britain's highest peak, has accumulated centuries of stories about climbers experiencing phenomena that resist rational explanation. The crew, for their part, never flew rescue missions together again after that September day, each finding reasons to step back from volunteer work. The memory of the passenger they could not remember clearly enough to describe haunted them in ways more concrete absences might not have. A presence that had been undeniably there, yet had left almost nothing behind but questions and antique equipment that should not have existed in functional condition. The distress beacon, logged as evidence and stored in a police facility, occasionally activates without cause, transmitting its decades-old signal from inside a locked room when no one is in distress, suggesting that some calls for rescue echo across time in ways that rescue services are not equipped to answer. Brilliant sunlight reflected off Annapurna's snow-covered slopes on May 3, 2007, as a Nepalese rescue helicopter departed from Pokhara to retrieve a solo climber stranded at 23,000 feet on the mountain's northwest face. The AS-350B3, operated by Simrig Air and piloted by Captain Sagar Rai, was one of only a handful of helicopters in the world capable of reaching such extreme altitude. Co-pilot Pemba Sherpa and high-altitude rescue specialist Ang Dorje accompanied Rai. Their combined experience in Himalayan operations spanning decades and countless successful extractions from situations most would consider impossible. The stranded climber had activated his emergency beacon the previous evening after becoming pinned by exhaustion and altitude sickness on a narrow ledge, unable to ascend or descend safely without assistance. The morning conditions were ideal, with unusually stable weather and minimal wind at altitude, factors that made the high-risk rescue feasible. Rai had confirmed with meteorological services that the window would hold for at least 6 hours, providing adequate time for the operation. The helicopter climbed steadily, its engine straining in the thin air as they gained altitude, the massive bulk of Annapurna growing larger until it dominated the entire forward view. Radio contact with Pokhara remained clear through the ascent, with Rai providing regular updates on altitude, position, and aircraft performance. At 22,500 feet, he reported visual contact with the climber's location, a rocky outcrop visible against the snow, and began the delicate approach necessary to hover at such altitude where the margin for error measured in seconds. What happened next defied every principle of atmospheric physics the crew understood. A sphere of absolute darkness appeared directly ahead of the helicopter, materializing in the space between the aircraft and the mountain face. The phenomenon was not fog or cloud, which would have shown gradation and movement, but rather a defined absence of light, a blackness so complete it seemed to absorb rather than obscure. Rai's first instinct was to pull up and away, but before he could react, the helicopter entered the darkness. Inside the sphere, visibility dropped to zero. Instruments became useless as displays flickered and failed, and the usual sensory feedback that pilots rely on disappeared entirely. The crew could not see the mountain, could not see the horizon, could not even see the interior of the cockpit or each other. Then came the impossibility that would define their testimony. Each crew member experienced a sudden shift in perspective, a dislocation so profound it remained seared into their memory years later. They found themselves outside the helicopter, watching it from a distance of perhaps 50 meters, observing themselves sitting in the cockpit, struggling with controls. The perspective was clear and detailed despite the surrounding darkness. Rai could see his own hands moving across instruments, could see Pemba reaching for the collective, could see Ang Dorje bracing himself in the rear compartment. The experience was not like watching a video or imagining the scene, but rather like actually being outside the aircraft while simultaneously remaining inside it, consciousness existing in two locations at once. The sensation lasted for what felt like several minutes, though later attempts to determine the actual duration proved impossible. Each crew member described seeing the same thing: the helicopter hovering in darkness, their own bodies visible inside, and the strange quality of the blackness that surrounded everything, pressing in but never quite touching. Pemba would later describe it as watching through a window into a reality slightly offset from his own, seeing events that were happening to him while experiencing them from outside. The crew's descriptions matched in the specific details they observed, each able to describe what the others had been doing during the episode, confirmations that suggested a shared external viewpoint rather than individual hallucinations. The darkness dissipated as abruptly as it had formed, and the crew found themselves back in normal perception, instruments functioning again, the mountain visible ahead. Rai completed the rescue extraction with mechanical precision born from training, his hands moving through procedures while his mind struggled to process what had occurred. The stranded climber was secured in the helicopter, and they began descent. The flight back to Pokhara completed in silence, broken only by necessary radio communications. None of the crew mentioned the darkness to air traffic control, uncertain how to articulate what they had experienced in terms that would not result in immediate grounding and psychological evaluation. At Pokhara Hospital, medical staff prepared to receive a standard case of altitude-induced exhaustion and exposure. What they encountered instead was profound disorientation that went beyond the expected effects of high-altitude trauma. The climber, once conscious and coherent, spoke in a language that no one could identify. It was not simply accented English or distorted speech from oxygen deprivation, but fluent articulation in words and grammatical structures that matched no known language. Linguistic experts brought in to assess the situation confirmed that the speech patterns followed consistent rules suggesting actual language rather than gibberish, yet they could identify no root language or family to which it might belong. More troubling was the climber's complete confusion about the date. When finally understanding was established through drawings and gestures, he insisted with absolute certainty that the year was 1952. He became agitated when shown newspapers, calendars, anything that suggested otherwise, treating the evidence as elaborate deception. Medical examination revealed him to be approximately 30 years old, yet the equipment found in his possession dated to the early 1950s. His climbing gear, though showing use and weathering, consisted of hemp ropes, steel carabiners of designs long obsolete, and clothing made from materials and with construction techniques that had not been employed in modern mountaineering for half a century. The pristine condition of items that should have degraded over decades suggested either meticulous preservation or something far more inexplicable. The hospital staff secured him in a private room for observation and further assessment, hoping that time and proper medical care might resolve his disorientation. Security protocols were standard, the same procedures used for any patient requiring monitoring. Yet when nurses entered the room the following morning for routine checks, they found it empty. The door had remained locked from outside throughout the night. Security cameras showed no one entering or leaving, and the window was sealed and undisturbed. The patient had vanished as completely as the sphere of darkness that had swallowed the helicopter on Annapurna's slopes. His equipment remained, laid out on the room's table, as though arranged for display. Forensic analysis confirmed the dates suggested by visual inspection. Rope fibers matched hemp production techniques from the 1940s and 1950s. Metal composition of carabiners reflected alloy formulations used before modern aerospace metallurgy, and fabric dyes in the clothing had been synthesized using processes discontinued decades earlier. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials placed them firmly in the mid-20th century, yet they showed none of the deterioration that natural aging would have imposed. They existed as artifacts from another time, preserved through unknown means and carried by someone who should not have been where the helicopter found him. Rai, Pemba, and Ang Dorje submitted detailed written accounts of their experience to Nepalese aviation authorities, each independently describing the darkness and the out-of-body perception. The consistency of their testimonies prevented easy dismissal, particularly given their reputations and the physical evidence of the anachronistic equipment. The official investigation noted the unusual circumstances, but could offer no explanation that encompassed all the elements. Weather data showed no atmospheric phenomena at the time and location that could account for the darkness. Medical evaluations of the crew revealed no neurological or psychological abnormalities that might explain shared hallucination. Buddhist monasteries in the Annapurna region, when consulted, showed less surprise than the Western investigators expected. Senior lamas spoke of the mountains as places where the veil between different states of existence grows thin, where consciousness can slip between worlds if conditions align. They described the darkness not as absence of light, but as presence of something else, a momentary opening to spaces where the rules governing ordinary perception cease to apply. The Sherpa community, whose relationship with the Himalayas extends back centuries, acknowledged similar stories passed through generations, though few climbers returned from such encounters to tell of them. The helicopter continued flying rescue missions on Annapurna and surrounding peaks, though Ryan noted in private conversations that certain areas of the mountain carried a weight he could not quite describe, regions where he flew with heightened vigilance for reasons his instruments could not measure. Other pilots working high-altitude rescues in the region occasionally reported momentary visual distortions or brief episodes of disorientation, though none described anything approaching the complete dislocation Rai's crew had experienced. Whether the darkness remains present, visible only under specific conditions, or whether it appears and disappears according to patterns no one has yet identified, the crews who fly these missions now carry with them the knowledge that altitude and weather are not the only hazards the mountains hold. Somewhere in the ice and rock of Annapurna, perhaps still, exists a place where time fractured enough to release someone from 1952, and where 3 experienced rescue professionals briefly existed outside themselves while remaining simultaneously within, watching the impossible unfold from a perspective that should not exist. The Northern Lights danced across the Alaskan sky on October 11th, 1985, as an Alaska State Troopers helicopter lifted off from Fairbanks toward a hunting accident in the Brooks Range. Ribbons of green and violet aurora undulated overhead with unusual intensity, the kind of display that brought photographers out despite the late hour and cold temperatures. Pilot Sergeant Michael Chen and Trooper Paramedic David Kowalski had flown dozens of wilderness rescue missions together, many of them at night, and while the aurora provided dramatic backdrop, it posed no operational concern. The distress call had come through via emergency radio from a hunter identifying himself as Robert Mackenzie, reporting that his companion had suffered a severe leg injury from a bear encounter and required immediate evacuation from their camp 30 miles north of the Dalton Highway. Chen navigated by instruments and the faint lights of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline that marked their route northward. The aurora intensified as they flew, sheets of light now reaching nearly to the zenith, pulsing with rhythms that seemed almost deliberate. Kowalski, monitoring communications and preparing medical supplies, noted that the aurora was affecting radio transmissions, introducing crackling interference that made conversations with Fairbanks increasingly difficult. At approximately 11:47 p.m., Chen reported their position as approaching the coordinates Mackenzie had provided and began descending toward the forested valley where the hunting camp was supposed to be located. What occurred next violated every understanding Chen and Kowalski had of atmospheric phenomena. The aurora, which had been overhead, suddenly appeared to descend toward them, curtains of light dropping from the sky as though solid rather than electromagnetic discharge in the upper atmosphere. The helicopter flew directly into what Chen would later describe as a wall of colored light, not passing through as one would with fog, but making contact with something that had presence and resistance. The instant of contact was accompanied by total instrumentation failure. Altimeters froze, compasses spun wildly, GPS displays went blank, and the radio produced only a high-pitched whine that hurt to hear. More unsettling was the physical sensation that swept through both men, a tingling that moved across their skin like static electricity, but penetrated deeper, seeming to vibrate through bone and organs. The helicopter emerged from the aurora after what felt like only seconds, but left both crew members disoriented and struggling to re-establish control. Chen focused on maintaining stable flight while instruments gradually came back online, readings appearing erratic at first before settling into normal parameters. Kowalski attempted to contact Fairbanks but received no response, the radio still producing intermittent bursts of the painful whine. Below them, they spotted lights that appeared to be a camp, and Chen brought the helicopter down in a clearing adjacent to what proved to be Mackenzie's location. Two men emerged from a tent, one supporting the other, and Kowalski immediately moved to assess the injured hunter's leg wound. The injury was consistent with what had been described, a deep laceration that required stitches and carried risk of infection, but was not immediately life-threatening. What struck Kowalski as strange was Mackenzie's confusion about the date. The hunter insisted repeatedly that he had made his distress call earlier that same day, October 11th, though he seemed certain the year was 1981. When Kowalski gently corrected him, explaining it was 1985, Mackenzie became agitated, demanding to see identification or anything with a date on it. The injured hunter, Thomas Bradford, appeared equally confused, and their equipment, when examined more closely, matched what would have been current technology and gear in the early 1980s, but was slightly outdated for 1985. Nothing was obviously antique, just subtly behind the times in design and wear patterns. The return flight to Fairbanks passed without incident, though both Chen and Kowalski noted that the aurora had diminished significantly, returning to normal patterns and intensity. Radio communications with Fairbanks re-established normally, and the helicopter landed at the Alaska State Trooper Aviation Facility without further anomaly. It was only when ground crew approached the aircraft that the physical evidence of the aurora encounter became apparent. The helicopter's exterior, particularly along the rotor blades and the upper fuselage, bore patterns of discoloration that resembled burn marks but followed the swirling forms of aurora rather than heat damage. The marks were not char or melting, but rather changes in the paint and metal surface itself, as though the aurora had left its imprint directly on the material. Aviation maintenance personnel inspected the damage with growing confusion. The patterns defied conventional explanation. They resembled radiation burns in texture and appearance, but carried no residual radioactivity when tested with standard equipment. The discoloration penetrated through multiple layers of paint into the metal substrate, suggesting exposure to intense energy. Yet there was no associated heat damage, no warping or stress to the underlying structure. The marks followed graceful curves and spirals that precisely matched the visual patterns of aurora borealis, as though the lights had been pressed against the helicopter like a photograph in development solution. No known aviation damage matched these characteristics, and samples sent to materials laboratories for analysis revealed molecular-level changes in the metal's crystal structure without any identified cause. Mackenzie and Bradford underwent medical evaluation at Fairbanks Memorial Hospital, where their identification documents provided the next layer of mystery. Both men carried Alaska hunting licenses issued in 1981, their photographs showing them at ages consistent with current appearance. The licenses were authentic according to state records, not forgeries or clever fakes, and the men themselves matched descriptions from driver's licenses also dated to the early 1980s. Yet state databases showed no record of license renewals for either man after 1981, as though they had simply stopped interacting with any official system 4 years earlier. Background checks revealed that both men had been reported missing in October 1981 after failing to return from a hunting trip to the Brooks Range. The original search operation had found no trace of them or their camp, and after extensive efforts, they had been presumed dead by exposure or accident. When confronted with this information, both hunters became distraught, insisting that their last clear memory was of making the emergency call after Bradford's injury and then seeing the rescue helicopter arrive hours later. They had no recollection of 4 missing years, no memory of where they had been or how they had survived. Medical examination showed them to be in good health considering the injury, with no signs of prolonged wilderness survival, no advanced malnutrition or exposure damage that should have accumulated over years living rough. Their bodies suggested they had been in the field for days, perhaps weeks at most, not the 48 months that had passed in the outside world. NASA's Geophysical Institute at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks, took interest in the case, particularly the physical evidence on the helicopter. Researchers studying aurora phenomena had long documented unusual magnetic and electrical effects associated with particularly intense displays, but nothing in their data suggested aurora could produce physical contact or leave material traces. The burns on the helicopter suggested energy transfer of a type not previously recorded, and the timing of the incident during peak aurora activity was too significant to dismiss as coincidence. Attempts to recreate the damage in laboratory conditions failed, even when subjecting similar materials to electromagnetic radiation, matching aurora wavelengths and intensities. The patterns remained unique, unexplainable, through conventional physics. Inuit elders from communities across northern Alaska, when asked about aurora encounters, shared stories passed through generations about the lights as doorways or pathways between worlds. They spoke of aurora not merely as atmospheric displays, but as living phenomena with intention and agency. In their traditional knowledge, aurora could take people who flew too close, or who encountered them at moments when the barriers between times grew thin. The 4-year displacement of Mackenzie and Bradford fit within frameworks these stories provided, though the elders acknowledged that survivors of such encounters were rare enough to be remarkable. Most who entered the lights, according to these accounts, never returned at all. The helicopter returned to service after repairs replaced the damaged sections, though some pilots who flew it afterward reported feeling uneasy during aurora displays, a sense that the aircraft retained some memory of its passage through the lights. Chen and Kowalski continued flying rescue missions, but both developed a heightened wariness of intense aurora activity, altering flight paths to avoid flying directly beneath the most active displays. Whether the aurora over Alaska contains spaces where time moves at different rates, or whether it serves as a threshold through which people can slip between years, remains a question that conventional science cannot yet address. The burn patterns on a helicopter and 2 hunters who lost 4 years without living them stand as evidence that northern lights may be more than the beautiful, harmless displays most observers assume them to be. The Mediterranean stretched calm and blue on July 8, 1994, as an Italian Coast Guard helicopter departed from Sicily toward a distress call from a yacht near the Strait of Messina. The morning conditions were perfect for maritime operations, with light winds and visibility extending to the horizon, the kind of day when pleasure craft dotted the waters in numbers that kept rescue services busy with minor incidents. Lieutenant Marco Bellini piloted the AW139 with co-pilot Sara Moretti, while rescue swimmer Antonio Ricci prepared equipment for what was expected to be a routine assistance call. The yacht, registered as the Stella Marina, had transmitted a brief Mayday citing engine failure and requesting a tow, providing coordinates that placed it just south of the strait's narrowest passage. The flight time to the reported position was under 30 minutes, and Bellini maintained visual contact with the water throughout, scanning for the distinctive white hull of a leisure yacht. When they arrived at the coordinates, the Stella Marina was exactly where its crew had reported, floating without apparent distress on the gentle swells. What immediately struck the Coast Guard crew as wrong was the vessel's appearance. The yacht showed weathering that suggested decades of exposure to sun and salt, its white gel coat yellowed and chalking, metal fittings corroded in patterns that develop over years of neglect, not weeks of careful maintenance. The Italian flag at the stern hung faded and threadbare, colors bleached to pale shadows of their original vibrancy. Bellini circled the yacht, while Moretti attempted radio contact, receiving weak but clear responses from someone identifying himself as Captain Franco Benedetti. His voice sounded elderly, wavering with the uncertain cadence of advanced age, and he seemed confused by basic questions about his situation. Ricci was lowered to the yacht's deck, finding it deserted except for 2 figures visible in the cockpit, both appearing to be in their 70s or 80s, despite the vessel's registration showing the owner as a 42-year-old man and his 38-year-old wife. The couple who emerged to meet Ricci moved with the careful slowness of the elderly, their skin deeply wrinkled, hair completely grey, hands showing prominent veins and age spots. The disconnect between their appearance and the yacht's registration created immediate confusion. Ricci confirmed their names as Franco and Maria Benedetti, matching the ownership documents. But the photographs on those documents showed a middle-aged couple bearing little resemblance to the elderly people standing before him. When questioned about how long they had been at sea, Franco insisted they had departed from Palermo 4 days earlier for a short cruise along the coast. Marina records confirmed the Stella. Marina had indeed departed Palermo on July 4th, just 4 days prior, yet the physical condition of both the vessel and its occupants suggested far more time had passed. The helicopter winched both Benedetti and his wife aboard for medical evaluation and transport, while a Coast Guard patrol boat was dispatched to tow the disabled yacht to port. During the flight to Messina, Moretti noticed something peculiar about the helicopter's instrument panel. The primary chronometer showed the correct time, synchronized with ground control, but 2 backup timing systems displayed different readings. One showed a time 3 hours behind, the other nearly 2 days ahead. All 3 systems had been functioning normally and synchronized when they departed Sicily less than an hour earlier. Moretti pointed out the discrepancy to Bellini, who confirmed that his own wristwatch showed yet another time, several hours off from any of the helicopter's displays. At Messina General Hospital, physicians examining the Benedettis struggled to reconcile the impossible timeline. Medical assessment revealed aging consistent with people in their late 70s, not the early 40s their identification indicated. Bone density, skin elasticity, cardiovascular markers, even the telomeres in their blood cells all showed decades of natural aging. There were no signs of progeria or other accelerated aging disorders, no evidence of disease or toxic exposure. They appeared to be exactly what they looked like: elderly people who had aged naturally over 70+ years. Yet harbor records, confirmed through multiple sources and security footage, showed them departing Palermo 4 days earlier, looking precisely as their current photographs depicted them, healthy and middle-aged. The confusion extended to their own perception. Both Franco and Maria insisted, with increasing agitation as they were contradicted, that only 4 days had passed since their departure. They could describe their journey in detail, the ports they had visited, the weather they had experienced, all consistent with a 4-day coastal cruise. When shown mirrors and asked to account for their aged appearance, they became distressed, unable to understand or accept what they saw. Maria wept, touching her wrinkled face with shaking hands, while Franco demanded explanations from doctors who had none to provide. Investigation of the Stella Marina itself revealed further contradictions. The yacht's provisions and fuel were consistent with a vessel 4 days into a journey. Fresh food in the galley showed appropriate levels of consumption for that time frame. Water tanks held amounts matching expected usage, and the fuel remaining in the tanks aligned with 4 days of modest motoring. Navigation logs kept by Franco documented each day of the trip, with entries that matched dates beginning July 4th. Yet the physical degradation of the yacht structure suggested decades of weathering. Paint samples analyzed in Coast Guard laboratories showed UV exposure and oxidation patterns requiring years, possibly decades, to develop under normal conditions. Wood trim had weathered in ways that occur only through long-term exposure to moisture and temperature cycles. The chronometer issue aboard the rescue helicopter was never fully resolved. Aviation technicians examining the systems found all three timing mechanisms functioning correctly, yet they continued to display different times from each other until the helicopter underwent complete electrical system replacement. The discrepancy served as tangible evidence that something about the rescue operation had fractured time's normal progression, leaving physical traces in the helicopter's electronics. Franco and Maria Benedetti remained in medical care for several weeks while specialists attempted to understand their condition. No treatment could reverse or explain the aging that had occurred, and eventually they were released to the care of family members who struggled to accept that their vital, middle-aged relatives had somehow become elderly in less than a week. The couple themselves never fully accepted the transformation, maintaining, until their deaths several years later, that the world had somehow changed around them while they experienced only a brief coastal cruise. The Strait of Messina, where Scylla and Charybdis of ancient legend guarded the passage, has accumulated centuries of stories about strange occurrences and vessels that entered its waters only to emerge changed. Whether the strait holds some property that affects the passage of time, or whether the Benedettis encountered a localized temporal anomaly that ages selectively while leaving other markers untouched, remains as mysterious as the classical monsters that once explained the strait's dangers. The Stella Marina was eventually sold for scrap, its impossible weathering making it unseaworthy despite its recent departure, while the helicopter that rescued its crew carried for months afterward the evidence of conflicting times, a reminder that some rescues retrieve people from situations far stranger than engine failure or high seas. Fresh powder blanketed the Canadian Rockies on January 25, 1998, as a private heli-skiing operation dispatched a rescue helicopter to retrieve an injured skier near Revelstoke. The commercial operation, running groups of expert skiers to remote peaks for pristine descents, maintained its own rescue capability for the inevitable injuries that occurred despite careful guidance and avalanche assessment. Pilot Christine Armstrong and ski patroller Mark Sullivan departed from the company's base lodge at 2:15 p.m., responding to a radio call from guide Jeremy Walsh, reporting that one of his clients had suffered a severe knee injury on a steep face and could not ski out under his own power. The weather conditions remained excellent, the same clear skies and stable snowpack that made the day ideal for skiing also made helicopter operations straightforward and safe. The injured skier, Toronto businessman David Chen, waited with Walsh at the accident site while the rest of the group continued their descent to a pickup zone lower on the mountain. The helicopter's flight time to the coordinates Walsh provided should have been 12 minutes, a routine extraction that Armstrong had performed countless times in her 5 years flying for the operation. Radio contact remained clear throughout the brief flight, with Walsh confirming he could hear the helicopter approaching. Armstrong spotted the two figures on the slope exactly where expected, their bright ski clothing visible against the snow, and began her approach to land on a relatively flat section nearby. What happened in the next moments exists primarily in the testimony of those involved and in footage that should not be possible. Armstrong completed the landing, and Sullivan moved to assist Chen into the helicopter, conducting a quick assessment of the knee injury before securing him in the passenger compartment. Walsh climbed aboard as well, and Armstrong lifted off for the return flight. According to all 4 people on the helicopter, the flight back to the lodge took perhaps 8 minutes, entirely routine and uneventful. They were confused when ground crew at the lodge, upon seeing the helicopter approach, immediately began asking where they had been for the past 18 hours. The helicopter had departed at 2:15 p.m., according to multiple witnesses and the operations log. It returned at 8:47 a.m. the following morning, nearly 19 hours later. Yet everyone aboard insisted they had just completed a brief rescue mission, lasting less than half an hour total. The discrepancy was so absolute, so incomprehensible, that initial reactions assumed some kind of joke or miscommunication. When it became clear that the lodge staff was serious, that an entire night had passed while multiple search and rescue teams scoured the mountains looking for the missing helicopter, the 4 people aboard struggled to process what they were being told. All 4 watches, worn by Armstrong, Sullivan, Walsh, and Chen, had stopped at exactly 2:23 p.m., 8 minutes after departure from the lodge. The synchronization was precise down to the second, as though all 4 timepieces had encountered the same force simultaneously. When wound and restarted, they resumed normal function, showing no damage or defect that might explain the Chaucer stoppage. The helicopter's onboard clock showed a time consistent with the crew's perception of events, not with the 18 hours that had passed in the outside world. The evidence that transformed this from a temporal anomaly into something far stranger came from Chen's helmet camera. The businessman had been recording his skiing throughout the day, wearing a camera mounted to his helmet that captured both video and audio continuously. The camera had recorded through the rescue and helicopter flight, and when the footage was reviewed, it showed a landscape that existed nowhere in the Canadian Rockies, or perhaps anywhere on Earth. The mountains visible through the helicopter's windows bore no resemblance to the familiar peaks around Revelstoke. These were taller, steeper, with rock formations and snow patterns that matched nothing in the surrounding ranges. Experienced guides who knew every named peak in the region could not identify a single feature in the footage. More disturbing was the quality of light in the video. The sky appeared in the footage, visible through breaks in conversation and camera angles, showed a color that was wrong, a purple tinge that should not exist in natural daylight. It was not the purple of sunset or the effect of polarization, but rather as though the atmosphere itself had a different composition, filtering light in ways Earth's sky does not. The vegetation visible on lower slopes in some frames was equally impossible. Trees appeared in the footage that matched no species found in Canadian forests, their branch patterns and foliage unlike pine, spruce, fir, or any other conifer that should have been present at that altitude. Geographic analysis of the footage proved fruitless. Experts attempted to match the mountain profiles to known ranges, not just in Canada, but worldwide, searching for any place that might correspond to what the camera had captured. Glacial formations, rock strata, even the patterns of snow accumulation were compared against databases of mountain terrain from the Himalayas to the Andes to the Alps. Nothing matched. The landscape in the footage appeared to exist in no documented location on Earth, suggesting either an extraordinarily remote and uncharted region or something far more unsettling. The audio track of the video captured normal conversation among the helicopter's occupants, discussion of Chen's injury, and the best approach angle for landing at the lodge. Their voices showed no indication they noticed anything unusual about their surroundings. When played back for them, all four expressed shock at the landscape visible in the frames, insisting they had seen nothing strange during the flight, nothing that alerted them to being anywhere other than the familiar mountains around Revelstoke. The disconnect between what the camera recorded and what the passengers remembered seeing suggested that their perception had been somehow filtered, showing them expected scenery while the camera captured actual surroundings. Search and rescue teams that had spent the night looking for the helicopter reported covering vast areas of the Selkirk and Monashee ranges without finding any trace. Weather throughout the night had remained clear, and multiple aircraft with sophisticated detection equipment had searched without result. The helicopter had not been hiding in the mountains around Revelstoke because it apparently had not been in those mountains at all during the missing 18 hours. Where it had been and how it returned to a location minutes away from where it had departed despite losing most of a day remained questions that aviation authorities could not begin to address. Chen's knee injury was treated at a local clinic, the damage consistent with a skiing fall, and subsequent hours without proper immobilization. Medical examination showed inflammation and swelling patterns matching the 18-hour timeline rather than the 30 minutes the injured skier had experienced. His body had aged through those hours, even if his consciousness had not. The same proved true for all aboard when more detailed medical tests were conducted. Biomarkers, cellular processes, even the stubble growth on Walsh's face suggested nearly a full day had passed, contradicting their subjective experience but aligning with objective external time. The helicopter remained in service, its mechanical systems showing no anomalies, though some pilots who flew it afterward reported moments of disorientation when operating in certain valleys, brief instances where the surrounding peaks seemed unfamiliar before resolving back into known geography. The helmet camera footage has been analyzed extensively, but yields no answers beyond confirmation that for some period the helicopter existed somewhere other than the Canadian Rockies, in a place with different light, different mountains, perhaps different physical laws governing the passage of time. Whether that place exists parallel to our world, or whether the helicopter briefly slipped into some fold in reality where geography rearranges itself, remains as mysterious as the purple sky captured in those impossible frames. Morning fog lifted from New Zealand's Canterbury Plains on June 4, 1989, as a rescue helicopter departed Christchurch Hospital toward a tramping accident on Arthur's Pass. The Squirrel helicopter, operated by the Westpac Rescue Service, carried pilot Graham Foster, flight paramedic Helen Morrison, and volunteer rescue coordinator Tom Bradley, responding to a distress call from a group of trampers whose companion had suffered what appeared to be a broken ankle on the Avalanche Peak track. The injury itself was straightforward, requiring stabilization and evacuation, but not immediately life-threatening, and the morning's clearing weather made the flight into the Southern Alps routine by the standards of New Zealand mountain rescue. Foster navigated the familiar route through the river valleys that, led toward Arthur's Pass, the helicopter climbing gradually as the terrain rose toward the Alpine zone. Radio contact with the tramping party confirmed their position near the bush line, accessible by a brief hover and winch operation. Multiple groups were on the mountain that morning, taking advantage of the improving weather after several days of rain, and at least 3 separate parties would later provide witness statements about what occurred during the rescue. Their accounts, independent and consistent, described an impossibility that photographic evidence would confirm. As the rescue helicopter approached the accident site, trampers positioned at various points on the mountain began noticing something strange. 2 identical helicopters appeared to be converging on the same location from slightly different angles. The aircraft were indistinguishable, bearing the same registration markings, the same Westpac livery, even the same minor scuff marks and weathering patterns visible through binoculars. One tramper, photographer James Mitchell, raised his camera and captured several frames of both helicopters in flight simultaneously, their positions separated by perhaps 200 meters, but their appearance absolutely identical, down to details that should have been unique to individual aircraft. Inside the helicopter, Foster and his crew experienced their own version of the impossible. As they made their final approach to the landing zone, Foster spotted another helicopter approaching from the east, flying directly toward them. The aircraft was a perfect copy of the one he was piloting, visible through the windscreen with clarity that allowed him to see figures in the cockpit that matched the positions of his own crew. Morrison, looking out the side window, confirmed seeing the duplicate helicopter, and Bradley reported visual contact from his position in the rear compartment. The 3 crew members could see themselves piloting the other aircraft, a mirror image that flew with movements precisely synchronized to their own. Foster immediately altered course to avoid collision, banking away from the duplicate while attempting to contact it via radio. The radio transmission went through, but instead of reaching another aircraft, Foster heard his own voice speaking the words he was transmitting, a perfect echo with no delay, as though his radio was somehow feeding back his transmission instantaneously. The duplicate helicopter banked in the opposite direction, maintaining symmetrical distance, and both aircraft circled the accident site from different approaches, while the trampers below watched in confusion. Ground observers saw both helicopters land, one on each side of a rocky outcrop near where the injured tramper waited. The landing sites were perhaps 50 meters apart, both aircraft touching down within seconds of each other, rotors kicking up grass and loose stones in identical patterns. Rescue personnel appeared to dismount from both helicopters, and multiple trampers reported seeing 2 sets of crews approaching the injured man from different directions. Yet in the perception of Foster's crew, they experienced only their own landing, conducted their assessment of the patient, a 34-year-old man named Robert Hayes with a confirmed ankle fracture, and prepared him for transport in what seemed a completely normal rescue operation. The divergence in reality became undeniable when both helicopters lifted off. Ground witnesses saw 2 identical aircraft depart the mountain, one carrying the patient and crew, the other appearing to carry only crew. Yet Foster and his crew had no memory of there being a second helicopter after landing. From their perspective, they had conducted a single, straightforward rescue and were now returning to Christchurch with Hayes secured in the passenger compartment. Radio transmissions during the return flight were doubled, with Christchurch receiving 2 identical sets of communications on the same frequency, both from the same call sign, both reporting successful patient evacuation. When the helicopter landed at Christchurch Hospital, only 1 aircraft arrived. Ground crew and medical staff waiting to receive Hayes saw a single helicopter, not 2, and the crew disembarking showed no awareness that anything unusual had occurred until they were informed that multiple witnesses at Arthur's Pass had reported seeing duplicate aircraft. Foster's initial reaction was to assume the witnesses had seen a different helicopter operating in the area, but the photographic evidence removed any possibility of such explanation. Mitchell's photographs showed 2 helicopters with identical registration numbers visible on their tail sections, aircraft that were not merely similar, but absolutely identical in every detail that could be captured on film. The photographs were subjected to extensive analysis, searching for evidence of double exposure, manipulation, or optical illusion. Professional photo analysts confirmed the images were genuine, showing 2 distinct objects in 3-dimensional space, rather than artifacts of the photographic process. The helicopters appeared in different positions relative to background landmarks, with correct perspective and parallax, requiring them to be separate physical objects rather than reflections or processing errors. Aviation authorities examined the images with growing bewilderment, unable to provide any conventional explanation for how one helicopter could appear in 2 locations simultaneously. Radio recordings from the incident provided additional confirmation. The duplicate transmissions from Foster were not echoes or signal bounce, but distinct parallel communications occurring simultaneously on the same frequency. Analysis of the voice patterns showed identical speech with no time offset, as though 2 radios were transmitting the exact same words at precisely the same instant. The only comparable phenomenon in communications would be playing the same recording through 2 transmitters, but Foster was speaking live, his words not pre-recorded, making such synchronization impossible through any known mechanism. Hayes, the rescued tramper, remembered being approached by rescue personnel, but could not clearly recall whether 1 crew or 2 had assisted him. His memory of the event remained vague, clouded by pain and the disorientation of his injury, though he distinctly remembered feeling as though there were more people present than he could actually see. Other trampers at the site reported similar confusion, knowing they had seen 2 helicopters land, but struggling afterward to maintain clear recollection of 2 separate crews working simultaneously. Maori elders consulted about the incident spoke of wairua, spiritual essence that can manifest in multiple locations when the boundary between physical and spiritual worlds becomes thin. They described the phenomenon not as unusual within their traditional understanding, but as a visible manifestation of something that occurs regularly at levels humans typically cannot perceive. In their framework, the duplicate helicopter represented a moment when the spiritual aspect of the aircraft and crew became visible alongside the physical, both existing simultaneously, as they always do, but rarely seen together. The Arthur's Pass region, they noted, is known as a place where such visibilities occur more frequently than elsewhere. The Westpac Rescue Service continued operations with the same helicopter and crew, though Foster reported occasional sensations during flights of being watched or accompanied, feelings he could not rationalize, but that persisted for months after the incident. Other pilots flying rescue missions in the Arthur's Pass area have occasionally reported seeing helicopters that match their own distant mirror images that disappear when approached directly. Whether the phenomenon of June 4, 1989 was unique or simply the most thoroughly documented instance of something that occurs more regularly than official records suggest remains an open question, one that photographic evidence proves happened, but that physics has no framework to explain. A winter blizzard engulfed the Pyrenees on December 19, 2005, as a French PGHM helicopter departed from Luchon to rescue stranded climbers near the Spanish border. The Peloton de Gendarmerie de Haute Montagne, elite mountain rescue specialists, operated in conditions that grounded most aircraft. But the distress call from 3 climbers caught above the snowline allowed no delay. Pilot Lieutenant Jean-Marc Dulac, with rescue specialists Sergeant Philippe Arnaud and Corporal Marie Leclerc, had flown countless missions through Pyrenean storms, their training and equipment designed specifically for the mountain's notorious weather. Wind gusts exceeded 70 kilometers per hour, and visibility dropped to near zero as snow fell so heavily it appeared to move horizontally rather than down. The climbers had reported their position via emergency radio before their battery died, coordinates placing them on a ridge just below the Pic de Aneto, near where the border between France and Spain becomes uncertain in winter when snow obscures the markers. Dulac navigated primarily by instruments, the world outside the helicopter's windows reduced to an undifferentiated white that offered no visual reference points. Arnaud maintained radio contact with the Rescue Coordination Center in Toulouse, providing position updates every few minutes as they pushed deeper into the storm. The helicopter buffeted constantly, wind striking from unpredictable angles that required continuous correction to maintain course and altitude. At approximately 3:20 p.m., radio contact with Toulouse became intermittent, then failed entirely despite the equipment showing full functionality. Dulac attempted to turn back, but the storm's intensity had increased to the point where maintaining any heading became impossible. The helicopter entered what pilots sometimes call a whiteout within a whiteout, where even the usual subtle gradations of light that allow orientation disappear into absolute uniformity. For several minutes, the crew flew blind, trusting instruments, while the storm hammered against the aircraft's frame, until visibility began to improve, as suddenly as it had degraded. When the helicopter emerged from the worst of the storm, everything about the crew had changed. Dulac found himself speaking to Arnaud in French that sounded strange in his own ears, words and constructions that felt simultaneously natural and archaic. Arnaud responded in kind, and both men realized they could understand each other perfectly, but were using language neither had spoken before. Leclerc, checking their position against maps, discovered she could read the modern French on the charts, but instinctively thought in phrases and vocabulary from centuries earlier. All 3 experienced the linguistic displacement without panic, their professional training allowing them to continue the mission despite the profound wrongness of what was occurring. They located the stranded climbers within 20 minutes, finding them huddled together on an exposed ridge exactly where the coordinates had indicated. The rescue proceeded according to protocol, with Arnaud and Leclerc descending on the winch to secure the climbers in harnesses before extracting them to the helicopter. Once all 3 patients were aboard, Dulac turned for the return flight, noting that the storm had diminished significantly and navigation landmarks had become visible through the thinning snow. The language anomaly persisted throughout the flight, with the crew communicating fluently in their archaic French while remaining aware that something fundamental had shifted. Landing at Luchon brought the strangeness into focus for others. Ground crew approaching the helicopter immediately noticed that Dulac and his crew were speaking incomprehensibly, using words that occasionally sounded like French, but followed patterns no modern speaker would recognize. Linguists brought in to assess the situation identified the language as Old French, specifically dialects common in the Pyrenean regions during the early 16th century. The crew spoke it with native fluency, showing none of the hesitation or grammatical errors that would be expected if they were attempting to use an unfamiliar historical language. Their modern French had simply been replaced, as though their brains had been reprogrammed to access linguistic structures from 500 years earlier. The rescued climbers presented their own mystery. All 3 wore clothing that belonged to no modern manufacturer, garments constructed from wool and leather using techniques and patterns that matched historical examples from the 1500s. The materials themselves, when analyzed, showed dye compositions and weaving methods that predated industrial textile production. The climbers' confusion upon rescue had been profound, though none could later recall clearly what they had been confused about, their memories of the event fragmented and dreamlike. Medical examination at Tarbes Hospital revealed them to be in generally good condition despite exposure, but their recollections of how they came to be on the mountain remained vague and contradictory. The linguistic displacement affecting the helicopter crew persisted for exactly 72 hours. During this period, they could not access modern French no matter how they tried, their attempts to speak in contemporary language emerging as archaic constructions they could hear were wrong but could not correct. Hospital staff documented the phenomenon through recorded conversations, preserving evidence of fluent historical French spoken by people with no training in linguistics or history. Gradually, over the course of the 3rd day, modern language began to return. First, individual words would emerge correctly, then phrases, until finally their normal speech patterns reasserted themselves completely. The clothing worn by the rescued climbers was subjected to forensic analysis that confirmed its authenticity. Carbon dating of organic fibers placed the materials in the early 1500s, with margins of error measuring only decades. The construction techniques matched period-specific methods documented in historical textile research, down to details of stitching and fastening that were characteristic of Pyrenean mountain clothing from that era. Yet the garments showed no signs of the deterioration that 500 years should have imposed. They appeared worn from use, but preserved in impossible condition, as though they had been made decades earlier rather than centuries. Spanish authorities, when informed of the incident, given its occurrence near the border, conducted their own investigation and discovered historical records that added disturbing context. Multiple documents from the 1520s referenced disappearances in the same region of the Pyrenees, climbers and travelers who vanished during winter storms and were never found. Some accounts described rescue attempts that failed when search parties themselves became lost in blizzards, suggesting a pattern of temporal anomalies that might extend back centuries. Whether the French helicopter crew briefly existed in the same temporal space that had claimed those historical victims remained speculation, but the linguistic evidence suggested they had somehow accessed not just clothing, but cognitive patterns from that earlier time. Dulac, Arnaud, and Leclerc returned to duty after medical and psychological clearance, though all three reported ongoing moments when archaic language would surface unexpectedly in their thoughts, as though the 72 hours had left traces that never fully faded. The rescued climbers gradually recovered more complete memories of their experience, describing a sensation of having been waiting on the mountain for far longer than the few hours between their distress call and rescue, though they could not specify how long. Their modern climbing equipment was never found, as though it had been replaced entirely by the historical clothing they wore when rescued. The Pyrenees, forming a natural barrier between France and Spain for millennia, hold in their peaks and valleys the accumulated history of countless passages and disappearances, whether certain storms in certain locations act as doorways to other times, or whether the blizzard of December 2005 was a unique event that allowed 5 people to briefly touch the 16th century, remains as unclear as the whiteout conditions that precipitated it. The helicopter that flew through that storm continues in service, though some pilots report that during winter flights near the Spanish border, the French they speak occasionally sound strange in their own ears, words arranging themselves in patterns that feel both familiar and impossibly old. Smoke and ash billowed from Eyjafjallajökull on April 17, 2010, as an Icelandic Coast Guard helicopter approached to evacuate hikers trapped by the erupting volcano. The eruption had begun days earlier, growing in intensity until ash clouds grounded commercial aviation across Europe. But helicopter operations at low altitude remained possible for emergency evacuations. Captain Baldur Sigurdsson piloted the Super Puma with co-pilot Erna Jonsdottir and rescue specialist Gunnar Helgason, responding to a distress call from 4 hikers who had been photographing the eruption from what they thought was a safe distance when wind shifts had cut off their retreat route. The helicopter had clearance to approach from the south, staying below the densest ash concentrations while maintaining visual contact with the ground. Volcanic ash presents specific hazards to aircraft, its abrasive particles capable of damaging engines and obscuring windscreens. But the Coast Guard crew had extensive experience operating in Iceland's frequently active volcanic environment. Sigurdsson maintained altitude at 300 meters, well below the main ash plume that rose thousands of meters into the atmosphere, its dark column visible for miles as it bent eastward in the prevailing winds. The approach took them across terrain transformed by the eruption. What had been snow-covered glacial ice, now dusted with black ash that created stark patterns across the white surface. Visibility remained adequate despite the falling ash, and radio contact with the hikers confirmed their position on a ridge approximately 2 kilometers from the main vent. As the helicopter penetrated a denser concentration of ash, something unprecedented occurred in the crew's perception. Time itself appeared to accelerate, not in their subjective experience, but in the geological processes unfolding around them. Through the windscreen and side windows, they watched the volcano's behavior transform from the relatively slow pace of normal volcanic activity into something resembling time-lapse photography. Explosions that should have been separated by minutes occurred in rapid succession, each blast following the previous by mere seconds. Lava flows that typically advance at walking pace seemed to race down the mountainside, covering hundreds of meters in moments. The ash plume above them pulsed and surged with a rapidity that defied natural volcanic rhythms, expanding and contracting as though days of activity were compressed into minutes. Jónsdóttir attempted to record what they were seeing on the helicopter's forward-facing camera, capturing footage that would later baffle volcanologists. The video showed eruptive sequences that matched patterns observed over days or weeks during typical volcanic events, yet the timestamps indicated everything occurred within a span of 8 minutes. Lava that should have required hours to cool and solidify passed through visible stages of crystallization in seconds. Ash falls that would normally take extended periods to accumulate appeared to build deposits at impossible rates. The crew watched geological time accelerate around them while their own perception remained normal, creating a profound disconnect between their internal sense of duration and the external processes they observed. The sensation was not limited to visual observation. Helgason, monitoring instruments in the rear compartment, noticed the helicopter's chronometers behaving erratically. The primary clock continued advancing at normal speed, but 2 backup timing systems showed rates that fluctuated wildly, at times racing forward, at times appearing to slow or stop entirely. The aircraft's GPS system, which relies on precise timing to determine position, began showing impossible coordinates, as though the helicopter was moving at speeds far exceeding its actual velocity. Yet the ground below remained visible, and the helicopter's flight characteristics felt normal, suggesting the temporal distortion affected only certain aspects of reality while leaving others unchanged. When the helicopter reached the stranded hikers and began the evacuation, Sigurdsson noted that their watches showed times that did not align with the helicopter's instruments or the crew's own timepieces. The hikers reported waiting for rescue for what felt like 3 hours since their distress call, yet ground records showed only 45 minutes had elapsed. During the return flight, visibility improved as they left the ash cloud's densest regions, and the sense of accelerated geological time dissipated. The volcano returned to what appeared to be normal eruptive behavior, visible in the distance through the clearing ash. Back at Reykjavik, the helicopter underwent immediate inspection given the ash exposure. Maintenance crews found accumulations of volcanic ash in engine intakes and on exterior surfaces, concentrations consistent with far longer exposure than the actual flight time suggested. More significantly, samples of the ash collected from the helicopter showed anomalous composition when analyzed. While most particles matched the chemical signature of the 2010 Eyjafjallajökull eruption, a substantial portion of the ash displayed characteristics matching the volcano's previous major eruption in 1821. The older ash should not have been present in airborne clouds unless somehow lifted from deposits laid down nearly 2 centuries earlier. Yet its pristine condition and aerial distribution suggested it had been freshly erupted. Volcanologists examining the samples initially assumed contamination or sampling error, but repeated testing confirmed the presence of two distinct ash populations, with origins separated by nearly 200 years. The 1821 ash showed no signs of the weathering and chemical alteration that ground-based deposits from that eruption displayed. It appeared fresh, as though ejected simultaneously with the 2010 material, despite the century-plus gap between eruptions. The only explanation that fit the evidence was that the helicopter had somehow encountered ash from both eruptions at once, requiring either impossible contamination or temporal overlap between events separated by historical time. The hikers rescued from the volcano reported their own temporal confusion. The wait for the helicopter had felt interminable. Yet when they reviewed photographs taken on their digital cameras during that period, the timestamps showed far less time had passed than their perception suggested. More disturbing were images captured while the helicopter approached. Several photographs showed the aircraft in the distance, but the eruption visible behind it displayed characteristics that matched historical descriptions of the 1821 event rather than current activity. The ash column shape, the distribution of lava flows, even the color of the smoke aligned with detailed records from the earlier eruption, as though the hikers had briefly photographed not just through space, but through time. Icelandic folklore contains extensive traditions regarding volcanic activity and its effects on time and perception. Elders consulted about the incident expressed little surprise, noting that volcanoes in Icelandic tradition serve as places where the boundary between past, present, and future becomes fluid. They spoke of fire and earth as primordial forces that existed before human concepts of linear time, and suggested that during eruptions, those ancient patterns could reassert themselves, creating spaces where centuries collapse into moments or moments stretch into ages. The specific combination of volcanic heat, glacial ice, and ash at Eyjafjallajökull was described in old stories as particularly potent for such temporal distortions. The helicopter's camera footage was analyzed frame by frame, with geologists attempting to reconcile what it showed with known volcanic processes. The acceleration of eruptive events visible in the recording matched no observational data from any other volcanic monitoring. Either the crew had witnessed something completely unprecedented in volcanology, or they had briefly existed in a temporal stream where the volcano's activity spanned a far longer period than objective time would allow. The footage showed geological formation occurring at rates that typically require extended observation, as though the crew had been granted a privileged perspective on processes normally hidden by the slowness of Earth's deep time. Whether the ash cloud created a localized temporal anomaly, or whether volcanic eruptions inherently distort time in ways rarely observed and poorly understood, the Eyjafjallajökull incident suggests that Iceland's reputation as a land where fire and ice create otherworldly effects may have foundations deeper than metaphor. The Coast Guard helicopter continues flying rescue missions near active volcanoes, though crews now report their observations of eruptions with awareness that what they see may not always align with the time their instruments record, and that ash falling from Icelandic skies might carry with it fragments not just of stone, but of centuries. The Amazon canopy stretched endless and green on August 8, 2002, as a Brazilian Air Force helicopter departed Manaus toward a research station, reporting a medical emergency deep in the rainforest. The UH-60 Black Hawk, operated by the Força Aérea Brasileira, carried pilot Major Carlos Mendes and Medic Lieutenant Ana Silva, responding to a radio transmission from Dr. Eduardo Santos, requesting immediate evacuation for a colleague suffering from what he described as severe fever and respiratory distress. The research station, operated by the Instituto Nacional de Pesquisas da Amazônia, studied forest ecology from a small compound 300 kilometers southwest of Manaus, accessible only by river or air. Radio contact with Santos had been routine throughout the morning, his last transmission at 11:40 a.m., confirming that the patient was stable enough for helicopter transport. The flight followed the Rio Negro upstream before turning southwest into increasingly remote territory, where the jungle below showed no signs of human presence. Mendes navigated by GPS coordinates provided by the research station's last position report, the canopies beneath them unbroken, except for occasional clearings where rivers wound through the forest. At 12:35 p.m., the helicopter arrived at the coordinates to find the landing pad exactly where expected, a cleared area maintained specifically for supply flights and emergencies. Mendes brought the aircraft down smoothly, rotors kicking up leaves and small debris, and Silva prepared to assess and transport the patient. What they found defied everything the station's recent radio communications had suggested. The research compound stood abandoned, buildings overtaken by vegetation in patterns that required years to develop. Vines climbed walls and wrapped around support structures. Roots from nearby trees had pushed through foundations, and the cleared areas around buildings had been reclaimed by secondary forest growth. The structures themselves showed advanced decay, wood rotting in the humid environment, metal corroded by constant moisture, solar panels shattered and overgrown. Everything suggested decades of abandonment rather than the active research station that had been transmitting just hours earlier. Silva moved cautiously through the compound, while Mendes maintained position by the helicopter, both calling out for Santos and the research team. The interior of the main building revealed supplies and equipment left as though people had simply walked away, but every item showed the unmistakable signs of long exposure to the Amazon's relentless climate. Papers had yellowed and begun decomposing, fabric had mildewed and rotted, and electronic equipment bore the corrosion patterns that develop over extended periods. Personal items remained in sleeping quarters, photographs faded beyond recognition, clothing reduced to fragments by humidity and insects. Silva found a calendar in what appeared to be the common room, its pages stuck together but the visible date showing August 2002, the current month and year, yet the paper's condition suggested far greater age. Radio equipment in the station's communications center appeared functional at first glance, its lights still illuminated by backup solar power that somehow continued operating despite the collapsed panels outside. When Silva attempted to use it, the system responded, tuning to the frequency on which Santos's transmission had been received. Static filled the speakers, punctuated by fragments of voice that might have been words but remained too distorted to understand. Mendes, monitoring from the helicopter, confirmed receiving the same fragmentary transmissions on the aircraft's radio, both systems picking up something broadcasting from the station despite its obvious abandonment. The medical emergency that had prompted the flight never materialized. No patient awaited transport, no research team emerged from the forest, and thorough search of the compound and immediate surroundings revealed no human presence. Silver documented the site extensively with photographs, capturing the impossible contradiction between recent radio contact and obvious long-term abandonment. The helicopter departed after 90 minutes, carrying with it samples of documents and equipment as evidence of the compound's condition. Back in Manaus, military authorities reviewed the radio logs that confirmed multiple transmissions from the research station throughout the morning of August 8th. Voice analysis identified the speaker as Dr. Eduardo Santos, matching recordings from previous communications with the station. Yet personnel records showed Santos had been part of a research team that disappeared in the same region 15 years earlier, in 1987, when the entire staff of an INPA station had failed to respond to scheduled check-ins, and subsequent investigations had found no trace of them or their facility. The coordinates where Mendes and Silva landed matched historical records of that earlier station's location, a site that had been abandoned by the Institute after the disappearances and supposedly left to the jungle. Botanical analysis of vegetation samples from the site confirmed growth patterns consistent with 15 years of unmanaged tropical succession, not the hours since the last radio transmission. The documents Silva retrieved showed dating from the late 1980s, their paper composition and printing methods matching that period's technology. Yet the transmission logs were indisputable, showing clear communications received that morning from equipment that should have ceased functioning more than a decade earlier. Indigenous communities in the region, when consulted through Funai liaisons, spoke of places in the forest where time becomes trapped, where the jungle itself holds moments that refuse to release into the past. They described the rainforest not as a simple physical space, but as a living entity with its own relationship to duration, capable of preserving or replaying events, according to patterns humans cannot predict. The disappearance of research teams in such areas was acknowledged as part of the forest's nature, and the radio transmissions were understood not as fraud or malfunction, but as echoes of something that had happened 15 years earlier, somehow reaching across time to call for a rescue that could no longer help. The Brazilian Air Force conducted aerial surveys of the region, searching for the current research station that should have been operating, but found no active facility at any nearby coordinates. INPA confirmed they had no current operations in that sector, the area having been removed from their research portfolio after the 1987 disappearances. Radio monitoring in subsequent weeks occasionally detected fragments of transmission on the frequencies Santos had used, always too brief and distorted to contain usable information, as though the call for rescue continues broadcasting from a station that exists only in the past, reaching intermittently into the present without ever being answered in time. Whether the Amazon holds pockets where time moves differently, or whether certain events imprint themselves so strongly on a location that they replay across years, the station's radio continues to call for help that arrives too late, requesting rescue for researchers who disappeared into the jungle's green depths long before the helicopter could reach them. Antarctic winds howled across the Ross Ice Shelf on July 12, 1996, as a U.S. Navy helicopter departed from McMurdo Station for a routine supply run to a remote research camp, only to receive an urgent recall to McMurdo for a medical emergency. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Hayes piloted the SH-3 Sea King with co-pilot Ensign Michael Torres and flight engineer Chief Petty Officer Robert Kim, their outbound flight having covered roughly half the distance to the research camp when the emergency transmission came through. The recall provided minimal details, identifying only that a station member required immediate medical evacuation for injuries sustained in an equipment accident. Hayes banked the helicopter and began the return flight, the familiar landmarks of the ice shelf visible below, despite the perpetual twilight of Antarctic winter. Weather conditions deteriorated rapidly as they approached McMurdo, a whiteout forming with the sudden intensity characteristic of Antarctic storms. Visibility dropped to near zero within minutes, the distinction between sky and ice disappearing into uniform whiteness that made navigation purely instrumental. Hayes relied on GPS and radio guidance from McMurdo's control tower, their voices providing reassurance through the disorienting conditions. The helicopter descended through the whiteout following instrument readings, and when Hayes felt the skids make contact with the landing pad, she powered down to safe idle, while the crew prepared to receive the emergency patient. The world that revealed itself as they disembarked was wrong in ways that took several moments to register. McMurdo Station appeared as Hayes remembered it, the familiar cluster of buildings arranged against the ice, but people emerging to meet the helicopter wore cold weather gear in styles that had been phased out years earlier. The faces approaching through the diminishing whiteout belonged to crew members Hayes recognized, scientists and support staff she had known. But these were people who had rotated home long ago, some as much as a decade earlier. Station Commander Daniel Morrison approached, calling out greetings to Hayes and her crew, and his presence created immediate cognitive dissonance because Morrison had completed his Antarctic tour in 1988 and now worked at a desk in Norfolk, Virginia. Hayes felt reality tilting, but maintained professional composure, following Morrison into the station's medical facility where an injured technician awaited transport. The interior of McMurdo matched her memories of the station's layout, but subtle details accumulated into overwhelming wrongness. Computer terminals displayed operating systems obsolete by current standards. Wall calendars showed dates from July 1987, and the general atmosphere of the station carried the specific character of an earlier era in Antarctic operations. Torres and Kim moved through the procedures mechanically, their training allowing them to function despite visible confusion, loading the patient and conducting standard pre-flight checks, while the 1987 crew watched and assisted. The injured technician, conscious but in pain from a crushed hand, spoke with Hayes during the brief time before departure, asking questions about flight times and hospital facilities that suggested he believed the date on the station calendars was correct. His confusion at some of Hayes' responses indicated a disconnect in their temporal frameworks, but the urgency of his injury precluded extended conversation. Hayes lifted off from McMurdo, the helicopter rising into another whiteout that formed as quickly as the first, and she flew on instruments back toward what she assumed would be current-day McMurdo, though the experience of landing in 1987 had shaken her certainty about what constituted present reality. When the helicopter emerged from the whiteout and landed at McMurdo, Everything had shifted back to 1996. The crew, waiting to receive the patient, wore modern gear, computer systems visible through building windows, showed contemporary interfaces, and the personnel moving around the station were those currently assigned to the facility. Torres and Kim showed no recognition of having just been at a different version of McMurdo. No memory of seeing Morrison or any of the 1987 crew. When Hayes mentioned what had occurred during their first landing, both men looked at her with genuine confusion, their recollection of the flight containing only a single landing, the current one, with no awareness of the earlier touchdown in 1987. The patient provided no clarity. Medical staff receiving him noted injuries consistent with the type of accident reported, but station records showed no such accident had occurred that day in 1996. When Hayes pressed for details about when and where the injury happened, the technician's responses were vague and contradictory, as though his memory of the event existed in fragments that would not cohere into a complete narrative. His hand showed trauma that medical examination confirmed was recent, yet the specifics of how and when it had been sustained remained elusive. Hayes, alone among the crew, retained a memory of both landings. She could recall with perfect clarity the experience of landing in 1987 McMurdo, seeing people who should not have been there, loading a patient from a timeline 9 years removed from her own. Yet Torres and Kim insisted with absolute certainty that they had made only one landing, the current one, and their confusion at Hayes's account was genuine rather than feigned. The selectivity of the memory preservation suggested that something about Hayes's role as pilot, her position of authority and responsibility for navigation, had protected her awareness across the temporal shift in ways that had not applied to her crew. Investigation of station records from 1987 revealed documentation of an equipment accident on July 12 of that year involving a hand injury to a technician named James Sullivan. The details matched what Hayes remembered from the patient she had evacuated, down to the specific nature of the trauma. Sullivan had been treated at McMurdo's medical facility and eventually evacuated to New Zealand for surgery, recovering fully and completing his Antarctic tour before rotating home. His record showed he was currently living in Oregon, employed in private industry with no connection to current Antarctic operations. Yet the patient Hayes had transported existed in the 1996 present, a man with Sullivan's injury, but with no clear identity or documented presence at McMurdo. The whiteout conditions that bracketed Hayes's experience of dual timelines were analyzed by meteorologists searching for atmospheric phenomena that might explain temporal displacement. Antarctic weather systems create unique conditions not found elsewhere on Earth. Combinations of extreme cold, isolation, and the planet's magnetic field interactions that some researchers suggest might occasionally produce effects outside conventional physical models. Yet no weather pattern could account for selective memory. For one person retaining awareness of events that others who shared the same experience could not recall. Hayes completed her Antarctic deployment and returned to the United States, but the memory of landing in 1987 McMurdo never faded or grew uncertain. She could describe it with the same clarity as any other mission she had flown, every detail remaining accessible despite its impossibility. Torres and Kim, when questioned months later, maintained they had no recollection of anything unusual about the flight, insisting It had been a straightforward emergency evacuation with a single landing at contemporary McMurdo. The patient disappeared from medical records after initial treatment, his identity and current location becoming as elusive as the timeline from which he had been evacuated. Antarctica's reputation as a place where reality behaves differently than elsewhere on Earth extends beyond its extreme climate and isolation. Whether the ice holds within it layers of time that occasionally become accessible, or whether the conditions that prevail at the bottom of the world can create momentary bridges between different temporal states, Hayes's experience suggests that rescue missions to McMurdo might occasionally land not just at different locations, but at different moments, retrieving patients from emergencies that have already been resolved in one timeline while remaining urgent in another. The whiteout that allowed her to cross between July 1996 and July 1987 has not recurred in documented form, though pilots operating in Antarctic conditions sometimes report disorientation that goes beyond simple navigation difficulty, moments when the ice below seems to hold within it. Shadows of other times, other crews, other versions of the station that persist in places where the cold preserves not just bodies and equipment, but entire moments frozen outside the flow that governs the rest of the world. Morning mist hung low over the Sea of Japan on March 3, 2008, as a Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force helicopter departed from Maizuru Air Base toward a fishing vessel's distress signal near the disputed waters west of Noto Peninsula. The SH-60K Seahawk carried Pilot Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto, co-pilot Ensign Yuki Tanaka, and rescue swimmer Petty Officer Kenji Sato, responding to an emergency transmission from a vessel identifying itself as the Ryujin Maru. The distress call had been brief, reporting engine failure and requesting assistance, with coordinates placing the vessel approximately 40 nautical miles from the coast, in waters regularly patrolled by both Japanese and Korean maritime forces. Weather conditions were calm, with light fog that posed no operational difficulty for the helicopter's navigation systems. The flight to the reported position took less than 30 minutes, and Yamamoto spotted the vessel exactly where the coordinates indicated. What immediately struck the crew as unusual was the fishing boat's appearance. The Ryujin Maru was constructed entirely of wood, its design matching traditional Japanese fishing vessels from the early 20th century, rather than the steel-hulled boats that dominated modern fleets. The craft showed heavy weathering, its dark hull faded, and the paintwork that should have been bright reduced to pale ghosts of original colors. Fishing nets visible on deck appeared to be made of natural fiber rather than modern synthetic materials, and the overall impression was of a vessel that had somehow survived from another era. Yamamoto circled, while Tanaka attempted radio contact, receiving responses in Japanese that used grammatical structures and vocabulary that sounded archaic. The voice belonged to an elderly man who identified himself as Captain Ichiro Nakamura, requesting assistance with an engine that would not restart. His manner of speaking suggested education and formality from a period when such characteristics were more universal in Japanese maritime communication. Sato was lowered to the vessel's deck, finding it occupied by three men whose ages appeared to range from late 60s to early 80s, all dressed in work clothing that matched styles from decades past. The confusion deepened when Sato confirmed the vessel's name and registration with the captain. Nakamura produced documents showing the Ryujin Maru, registered in 1936. The papers yellowed but remarkably preserved, bearing official stamps from the pre-war Japanese government. Port records visible in the ship's log showed the vessel's last departure from Fushiki on February the 28th, just 3 days earlier according to Nakamura's reckoning. Yet the entries were dated 2008. The crew expressed no awareness that anything was unusual about their situation, beyond the mechanical failure that had prompted their distress call. The helicopter evacuated all 3 fishermen, Nakamura, and crew members Hiroshi Tanaka and Saburo Watanabe, leaving the Ryujin Maru to be secured by a Coast Guard patrol vessel. During the flight to Maizuru, the rescued men showed profound disorientation at the helicopter's technology, treating the aircraft with a mixture of awe and confusion that suggested genuine unfamiliarity with modern rotorcraft. Their questions about the helicopter's operation and their visible startlement at aspects of its equipment indicated they had never seen such technology before, despite helicopters having been common in Japanese maritime operations for decades. At Maizuru Naval Base, officials meeting the helicopter found themselves facing an impossible situation. All 3 fishermen carried identification documents from the 1930s, their photographs showing them as young men, but the faces now elderly. Naval records, when consulted, revealed that a fishing vessel named Ryujin Maru had been reported missing in March 1938 during a storm in the same general waters. The crew listed in the missing vessel report matched the names of the 3 men just rescued: Nakamura, Tanaka, and Watanabe. Yet here they stood, 70 years older than they should have been if they had vanished in 1938, insisting that only days had passed since their departure from port. Medical examination revealed the men to be in their 70s, their physical aging consistent with natural progression through 7 decades. Yet their memories contained no awareness of those years passing. They could describe their fishing trip in detail, the weather conditions on each day, the catches they had made, their routine maintenance of the vessel. The timeline they described spanned less than a week, a straightforward fishing expedition interrupted by engine trouble. When shown newspapers, modern vehicles visible through windows, or any evidence that 2008 rather than 1938 was the correct date, and they became distressed and disoriented, unable to reconcile what they were being shown with their firm conviction that they had just been fishing in familiar waters days earlier. The Ryujin Maru, recovered by the Coast Guard, underwent forensic examination that confirmed its construction dated to the 1930s. Wood samples, matched species, and harvesting techniques from that period. Metal fittings showed manufacturing methods discontinued before World War II, and even the paint chemistry aligned with pre-war formulations. Yet the vessel's condition suggested it had been maintained and used regularly. While showing age and weathering appropriate to 70 years, it lacked the complete deterioration expected from a boat abandoned at sea for decades. Someone or something had kept it functional during the missing years, though no evidence suggested who or through what means. The fishermen were eventually released to the care of distant relatives, identified through genealogical research, families who had long since held memorial services for ancestors lost at sea in 1938. The men themselves never accepted the temporal displacement, maintaining until their deaths several years later that the modern world around them was somehow the aberration rather than their experience. They spoke occasionally of the days between their engine failure and rescue, describing time that felt normal in its passage, yet somehow stretched impossibly long, as though they had been waiting not hours, but ages for help that came from a future they could not comprehend. Whether the Sea of Japan holds pockets where vessels can drift outside normal time, or whether the three fishermen experienced some selective temporal preservation that aged their bodies while suspending their consciousness across decades. The Ryujin Maru stands in a maritime museum now, a wooden fishing boat that should not exist in functional condition, a vessel that bridged 70 years in a journey its crew experienced as days. The waters where it was found remain among the most heavily fished in Japanese territory, but some captains avoid the specific coordinates where the Ryujin Maru drifted, waters that might hold other vessels trapped in temporal eddies, waiting for rescue that comes from futures their crews cannot anticipate, if it comes at all. Rain swept across Snowdonia on October 6, 1993, as a Welsh air ambulance helicopter lifted off from Caernarfon toward a fallen climber on the slopes of Tryfan. The call had come through the Mountain Rescue Coordination Center shortly after 2 p.m. A solo hiker named Martin Davies reporting via mobile phone that he had suffered a severe ankle injury after a slip on wet rock and could not descend without assistance. Pilot Gareth Williams and paramedic Rhian Evans had worked together for 3 years on mountain rescues throughout North Wales, and the reported injury, while painful and debilitating, represented a straightforward evacuation from a location the helicopter could access directly. Weather conditions were poor but manageable, with low cloud and steady rain, making visibility challenging but not impossible for experienced mountain pilots. Williams located Davies without difficulty, the hiker's bright red jacket visible against the grey rock of Tryfan's east face at approximately 2,400 feet. The evacuation proceeded exactly as planned, with Evans assessing a badly swollen ankle consistent with a significant fracture or severe sprain, before securing Davies in the rescue harness for winch extraction. The flight to Ysbyty Gwynedd in Bangor took 20 minutes, and Davies was admitted to the emergency department for X-rays and treatment. Evans completed the standard paperwork documenting the rescue, noting the time, location, and nature of injury before the crew returned to base. The mission was routine in every respect, identical to dozens of similar rescues conducted each year in the Welsh mountains. The following morning, October 7th, Williams and Evans responded to another distress call. The details transmitted by mountain rescue coordinators created immediate recognition. A solo hiker named Martin Davies had fallen on Tryfan's east face, suffering an ankle injury that prevented self-rescue. The location coordinates matched those from the previous day to within a few meters. Williams glanced at Evans, both registering the coincidence, though neither immediately grasped its full impossibility. They assumed Davies had been released from hospital and, against medical advice, returned to the mountain to retrieve equipment or complete his planned route, only to injure himself again in the same location. When the helicopter arrived at the coordinates, Davies was exactly where he had been 24 hours earlier, wearing the same red jacket, positioned on the same rocky ledge. Evans descended on the winch and immediately recognized not just the hiker, but the injury. The swelling pattern the angle at which the ankle sat, even the specific location of discoloration through Davies's wet boot, matched precisely what she had seen the day before. When she asked Davies if he had just been rescued yesterday, he looked at her with genuine confusion, insisting this was his first day on the mountain and his first injury. His certainty was absolute, showing none of the evasiveness of someone attempting to conceal a reckless decision to return to the mountain prematurely. The crew completed the second extraction, Davies expressing gratitude and surprise at the helicopter's rapid response to his call. During the flight to Bangor, Evans engaged him in conversation, asking about his climbing plans and when he had arrived in Wales. His answers remained consistent with someone beginning a hiking trip, not someone who had just spent a night in hospital. He described driving from Manchester that morning, parking at Ogwen Cottage, and beginning his ascent of Tryfans North Ridge before the slip that injured his ankle. The timeline he provided made no allowance for a previous rescue, hospital admission, or recovery period. At Ysbyty Gwynedd, the impossibility became undeniable. Hospital records showed no admission for Martin Davies on October 6th. The emergency department staff, when asked about treating a climber with an ankle injury the previous day, had no recollection of such a patient. Yet Williams and Evans could produce the completed rescue documentation from October 6th, forms bearing both their signatures and the official flight log entries showing the mission details. The paperwork existed, physical evidence that the previous day's rescue had occurred, but the hospital's systems contained no corresponding record of the patient's arrival or treatment. Davies himself remained adamant that this was his first and only rescue. Medical examination revealed an ankle injury that appeared fresh, showing none of the progression of healing that should have been present if he had injured it 24 hours earlier. X-rays displayed a fracture pattern that senior radiologists confirmed was acute, recent trauma rather than a day-old injury being re-aggravated. His confusion at the insistence that he had been rescued before grew into agitation, and he demanded that someone explain why they were so certain of events he knew had not happened. The crew's flight log became the central piece of evidence in what should have been a simple administrative discrepancy. The October 6th entry showed all required details: departure time, location coordinates, patient name, injury description, and arrival time at hospital. Williams' handwriting filled the forms, and the sequential log numbers confirmed this entry belonged where it appeared in the chronological record. Yet no other documentation supported that the rescue had occurred. No hospital admission, no X-rays from the previous day, no prescription records, no billing information. Davies had not existed in any official system on October the 6th, despite the helicopter having verifiably transported him. Welsh Air Ambulance conducted an internal review, searching for procedural errors that might explain the discrepancy. The possibility of fabricated records was explored and dismissed, the involved personnel too experienced and reputable for such breach of protocol. The alternative explanation that the rescue had occurred but left no trace beyond the flight log required accepting that selective reality preservation was possible, that some events could be recorded in certain systems while remaining absent from others. Local mountain guides familiar with Tryfan shared stories passed among the climbing community about the mountain's reputation for temporal strangeness. The east face in particular was known in these accounts as a place where rescues sometimes happen more than once, where the mountains seem to replay certain falls or injuries as though insisting on a different outcome. Whether these stories influence the crew's interpretation of events, or whether they represented accumulated wisdom about genuine phenomena, they provided a framework within which the double rescue could be understood, if not explained. Davies recovered from his ankle fracture and returned home to Manchester, carrying with him the confusion of being told he had experienced something he knew he had not. Williams and Evans continued flying mountain rescues, but both reported a lingering unease when called to Tryfan, a sense that the mountain might present them with situations that had already occurred or would occur again, rescues that loop through time, leaving only fragments of evidence that they happened at all. The flight log entry from October 6th remains in Welsh Air Ambulance records, an artifact of a rescue that both did and did not take place, depending on which system one consults for verification. Stars blazed over the Grand Canyon on a recent clear night as a National Park Service helicopter lifted off from South Rim to respond to a hiker's distress call near Phantom Ranch. The Bell 407 carried pilot Sarah Chen and ranger paramedic Daniel Ortiz, both veterans of canyon rescues who knew the terrain's challenges intimately, despite years of experience. The distress call had provided GPS coordinates, placing the hiker approximately 2 miles up the Bright Angel Trail, a location accessible by helicopter given the late hour and absence of other traffic on the popular route. Chen navigated using night vision equipment, the canyon's immense depth invisible below, except where moonlight caught the pale limestone of the rim. During the flight, something unusual occurred on the radio. The transmission from the distressed hiker came through clearly on the emergency frequency, a male voice requesting assistance for a knee injury. But beneath his words, faint and distorted, Chen and Ortiz both heard what sounded like an echo of the transmission, the same voice speaking the same words, but delayed by several seconds and carrying a quality that suggested it was traveling from much farther away than the 2 miles separating them from the hiker's position. The echo persisted throughout their approach, creating a disorienting overlay of present communication and something that seemed to arrive from a different time entirely. Chen located the hiker at the provided coordinates, his headlamp visible on a switchback of the trail. Yet as the helicopter descended, both crew members noticed a second light source approximately 50 meters away, another headlamp shining from nearly the identical position on an adjacent section of trail. The GPS confirmed they were at the correct location for the distress call, but the presence of a second hiker in such close proximity, without any mention of a companion, created immediate questions about who they were rescuing and who the other person might be. Ortiz was lowered to the trail, finding a man in his early 30s who identified himself as Kevin Martinez, confirming the knee injury that had prevented him from continuing his night hike. Martinez appeared confused when Ortiz asked about the other hiker visible nearby, insisting he was alone and had seen no one else on the trail for hours. Yet the second headlamp remained visible, its bearer standing motionless on the trail section that should have been empty. When Ortiz called out, the figure did not respond, and in the helicopter's spotlight, the second hiker appeared oddly indistinct, his form seeming to flicker at the edges as though not entirely solid. Chen maintained position while Ortiz secured Martinez in the rescue harness, but her attention remained fixed on the second figure. As the injured hiker was lifted toward the helicopter, she attempted radio contact with the other person, receiving no response despite the figure appearing to react to the spotlight, turning toward its source in a way that suggested awareness. Then, with no warning, the second hiker's headlamp extinguished, and the figure disappeared entirely, not walking away into darkness, but simply ceasing to be visible, as though he had stepped through a doorway that existed in the air itself. At the south rim, Martinez was transferred to an ambulance for transport to Flagstaff Medical Center. During the brief interaction before he was taken away, Ortiz asked whether he had seen anyone else on the trail during his hike. Martinez's response created more questions than it answered. He described encountering another hiker hours earlier, someone who had seemed disoriented and asked repeatedly what year it was. Martinez had assumed the person was suffering altitude sickness or dehydration, despite the canyon's relatively modest elevation. But the encounter had been brief before the other hiker continued descending toward the river. Park Service records, when searched, revealed a rescue at nearly identical coordinates 7 years earlier. In that incident, a hiker named David Chen, no relation to the pilot, had injured his knee on the Bright Angel Trail and been evacuated by helicopter during a night operation. The rescue report described unusual radio interference during the mission, with transmissions appearing to echo or repeat in ways the crew could not explain. More significantly, the 2016 rescue team had reported seeing a second hiker in the vicinity who had vanished before they could make contact, creating a mirror image of the current night's events. When David Chen was contacted and interviewed about his rescue 7 years earlier, his recollection included details that aligned disturbingly with the current incident. He remembered being injured, remembered the helicopter's arrival, but he also remembered seeing another injured hiker nearby, someone whose presence confused him because he had thought he was alone on the trail. His memory of that other hiker matched Kevin Martinez's appearance and approximate age, as though Chen in 2016 had seen Martinez before Martinez's 2023 rescue had occurred. The GPS coordinates for both rescues, when compared with precision measurement, matched to within 1 meter. Both hikers had sustained nearly identical knee injuries at the same location on the trail. Both rescues had occurred during night operations under clear skies, and both crews had reported seeing a second hiker who vanished without explanation, a figure that now appeared to be the other rescue victim existing simultaneously in a different time. Among park rangers with long service at the Grand Canyon, stories circulate about the canyon as a place where its geological depth creates temporal depth as well. The exposed rock strata, displaying nearly 2 billion years of Earth's history in visible layers, are sometimes described in these accounts as evidence that the canyon holds within it not just ancient stone, but ancient moments, times that occasionally surface into the present like fossils weathering out of rock. Whether the canyon's immense age creates conditions that allow different eras to briefly overlap, or whether the specific coordinates where both hikers were injured mark a location where time's normal progression breaks down. The pattern suggests that some rescues at the Grand Canyon may be responding to distress calls that echo across years, reaching back to previous incidents or forward to those yet to occur. Chen continues flying search and rescue missions into the canyon, though she reports that radio transmissions on certain frequencies occasionally carry beneath them the faint sounds of conversations that seem to come from other operations, other crews responding to emergencies that may have happened years earlier or may not have happened yet. The coordinates where Martinez was rescued have been noted in internal Park Service documentation as a location where temporal anomalies have been observed, though no official guidance suggests avoiding the area or treating it differently than any other point along the Bright Angel Trail. For those who study the Grand Canyon's mysteries, the doubled rescue adds to a growing collection of incidents that suggest the canyon's relationship with time may be as complex as its geology. Whether the stone walls that descend a mile into the earth somehow preserve or replay moments from the canyon's human history, or whether the sheer depth and age of the place creates conditions that allow different temporal layers to touch briefly before separating again, remains as unknowable as the origins of the canyon itself. Martinez recovered from his injury and returned home, carrying with him the ranger's questions about another hiker he never saw, while somewhere in the